Hey, I'm Luke, and today we're talking about The Path of Daggers, Book 8 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. I'm actually really excited to start talking about this book in particular because even though this is often called kind of the beginning of the Slog, it's also a great chance to talk about some stuff that I've actually been meaning to talk about for a couple of books now. In particular, it's some stuff about logistics and kind of how pre-industrial military stuff works. And this book has some excellent stuff to kind of dig into that from. So even though this is a very short book for The Wheel of Time, it's probably actually going to be one of the longer videos just because I really kind of dig into some of the details in here. I'm really excited. I think everyone's going to really like this one. Before I get into that, I do want to just say what I always say. If you haven't read this book yet, definitely stop watching this video right now and go read it first. This is not a video meant to be watched before reading the book. I'm going to spoil it heavily, and you really don't want me to do that. So if you haven't read the book yet, go read it, come back afterwards. If you're new to my channel, I have videos for all the books in order up to this point, so if you just found this video, great, you can just watch this one, but if you want, you could also go back and start from the very beginning. Though I will warn you right now, I've gotten a little bit better at video editing and bought a better camera partway through, so the first few videos are not gonna look quite as good as this, and I'll say I don't even know if I've quite nailed it here either, so it might be a little rough starting from the beginning, but it's there if you're interested. I definitely do build on topics throughout the videos, so it might be interesting to watch them in order. But in any case, before we get into the meat of it, I also want to have a summary. I know if you just read the book like I did, then a summary probably sounds really boring. So if you don't want to watch a summary, feel free to use the chapters below to go and just skip that and get right into the actual topics. But if it's been a while, I think most of the people watching these videos actually have already finished the series, probably years ago, and are kind of looking for a first-time reader's perspective to sort of relive it. So maybe a summary would actually be a good refresher to kind of remember what happens in this book, particularly considering that this is part of sort of the slog, so it might be a little difficult to kind of think back after finishing the entire series to like what specifically happened in the Path of Daggers as opposed to the next book or the one after that. With that out of the way, let's get right into the summary. We start off in the prologue with a secret meeting of the rulers of the Borderlands. That's Kandor, Arafel, Shinar, and Saldia. They're meeting in the Black Hills. Ethaniel, I think that's how you say that, is Queen of Kandor, Paitar Nachiman is King of Arafel, Iasar Togida is King of Shinar, and Tenobia is Queen of Saldia. They are traveling with 13 Aes Sedai and doing their best to avoid detection. They make a blood oath, we are one to the death. They will find Rand and do, quote, what needed to be done, but it's kind of hard to tell what exactly that is. Just killing him seems like kind of a stupid plan, so I guess that they actually mean to come to an arrangement, probably to form an alliance against Shaitan without being conquered as part of Rand's growing empire, but that's just speculation at this point. There are some comments on potential marriages and succession here that I think are mostly irrelevant to the rest of this book, except that Tenobia has no children, and thus Davram Bashir or his heir are the nearest heir for the throne of Saldia, so there's a real chance that Faile will become Queen of Saldia. We then have a short bit with Varen, who has pieced together a flawed version of compulsion from Wilders that she's interviewed over the years, and she's using this on the Datsane Aes Sedai in the Aiel camp. Her goal is to keep young Rand alive until it was time for him to die. We also get a short bit with Moradin, who is playing both sides of the board, his words. But we don't really know what this means yet. In particular, does he serve Shaitan either way, or does he potentially oppose even Shaitan? He also has an interesting comment that the Fisher, a piece in a board game that he likes from a previous age, may, quote, come from some dim remnant of a memory of Rand al'Thor. Moradin is tailing Elayne's group at the beginning of the book. He doesn't care about their cache of Terangriel, but he's furious that they might be able to undo Shaitan's alteration of the weather using the Bowl of the Winds. If not for Aviendha unraveling her gateway, Moradin may have been able to actually follow them. The Golem does not follow Moradin and doesn't remember what the true power is. It is ordered to kill Mat and the women, and it considers the women to be the easier of the two targets, as Mat's amulet is the first thing it ever remembers harming it. Moradin sends Moghedien, Shidar Haran, and a woman introduced as Sindain, meaning last chance, to Grendel. This is totally Lanfear, right? Moradin is openly declared to be nameless, and Grendel initially fights back, but quickly acquiesces to Shidar Haran. She will serve, but secretly holds that though Moradin may be nameless now, she may yet have her chance. Moving on to Elayne's group, the Athan Mir, the Kin, and the Aes Sedai. Throughout the book, tensions are high between the Athan Mir, the Kin, and the Aes Sedai. Nynaeve is distracted by Lan and isn't really helping much, so the responsibility is often left to Elayne, who continues the leadership that she began in the last book. Fortunately, Alice, one of the kinswomen, is very good at keeping everyone organized and in order. The Athan are haughty, feeling superior to the Aes Sedai due to the advantageous bargain they struck. The Athan will guide the channeling for the Bowl of the Winds, and in return, the Aes Sedai will provide them with 20 sisters to teach them whatever they want to know, unable to leave until others come to replace them. They can also visit the tower as guests, learn whatever they want, and leave whenever they want. And they get to keep the bowl. It really is a terribly lopsided deal, given that really they had as much interest in fixing the weather as anyone else. The kin, on the other hand, are still fearful of the Aes Sedai and are torn between wanting to join the tower and wanting to live freely. Some of the kin are very old and very powerful. Becoming novices and serving at the tower's whim might not sit well with them. They're also coming to learn that the Aes Sedai are not infallible or omniscient. Shortly before the Shan-Chan attack on Abu Dar, Elayne's group travels to a location that no one else knows about before moving on to the kin's farm. Alliandre unravels her gateway, which is shocking to everyone present. She risks this because she saw someone watching her. She comes to believe that she was just being paranoid, but we know that it was actually Moradin and the Golem wasn't far behind. They form a full circle to use the Bowl of the Winds, led by Caradin Geln Running Wave. The channeling is extremely powerful, shooting Sidon and Sidar throughout the sky. The weather doesn't change instantly, and we don't really see the full effect of this chapter, but it doesn't take long for winter to come on throughout the world, along with some fairly harsh storms, which kind of makes sense given that the weather has just been kickstarted back into normal working order. The Shan-Chan attack on Abu Dar occurs at roughly the same time as the channeling, and the immense power of their channeling is a beacon to them. Shan-Chan quickly move on the farm. Elayne, who created the gateway, tries to unravel it like Alliandre did as Shan-Chan begin to attack through the gate. Her unraveling fails, but fortuitously so, as it destroys all but one of the Shan-Chan at the farm and doesn't kill anyone on Elayne's side other than her horse, Lioness. They travel to Andor, to one of Elayne's estates not far from Caemlyn. Ispen, the Black Aja, is still being held prisoner. She's initially held by the kin, but eventually passed to Adelaus and Vandene, who put her the question whenever time allows. They're clearly employing torture. Not far from Caemlyn, Adelaus and Ispen are both found dead, having been given Crimson Thorn, which, in a high dose, causes paralysis and a slow death. It seems clear that Ispen was the primary target of the brutality. She has a stake pounded through her chest. So it seems clear that the culprit was a Dark Friend. It would seem that the killer is one of the group. Elayne finally arrives in Caemlyn to submit her claim to the throne. She encounters Dylan, who could be her greatest rival. Dylan asks whether Elayne has come to accept the throne from Ram, but she firmly responds that she's claiming the throne by her own right. Dylan seems to approve of this, and it seems as though she'll support Elayne. We don't see more from Elaine's perspective this book, but we learn from Rand that she quickly takes down his banners. Rand seems hurt by this, but he hasn't actually spoken to her directly yet. Moving on to Savannah and the Shaido. The Shaido have encountered some Shan-Chan, but don't really grasp how great of a threat they are, and don't seem to really understand how big an ocean is either. The Wise Ones finally confront Savannah, deciding that since she speaks as the clan chief, she also needs a Wise One advisor. Tharava, a particularly intimidating Wise One, will advise her. Still, Savannah is mostly in charge, though she's growing very anxious and a bit paranoid. Savannah offers Galena the chance to stop being Datsang, becoming a Gaishan instead, though note that Savannah is treating her Gaishan as permanent slaves. Galena swears an oath, on the oath rod provided by Samael, to obey all the Wise Ones assembled there, with Tharava and Savannah first among them. Moving on to Rand. Cadsuan and Sorleia speak about Rand. They agree that, like most men, Rand is mistaking hardness for strength, and he must rediscover laughter and tears, or else even his victory may be as dark as his defeat. The two women seem to be in alignment, but Cadsuan wonders whether their goals are truly the same. We can speculate that Sorleia's goal is to preserve that remnant of a remnant of the Aiel, while Cadsuan is most likely not so focused on the Aiel. In confirmation of Cadsuan and Sorleia's fears, Rand's thoughts are very dark and hard. Rand is openly king of Ilion, unlike his positions in Tyr, Andor, and Kirion. Lews Theron's voice is initially gone from Rand's thoughts, which causes him anxiety, but eventually reappears. Throughout the book, Rand is suffering some illness in channeling. Both seizing and releasing Sidon cause a severe bout of dizziness and nausea. To hide this, Rand has been holding on to Sidon as often as he can to avoid revealing his weakness. Recruiting for the Black Tower is going well. The newest count is 29 Ashaman, 97 dedicated, and 322 soldiers. As many as 50 recruiting parties add about 4 men per day. Yet, the brutal pace of their training is causing attrition in the recruits. Roughly 1 in 10 are killed or burned out, and 1 in 50 are going mad. Madness among them is treated with euthanasia, a bit of poison and wine. The Shan-Chan are organizing in the mountains west of Ilion, between Ilion and Abu Dar. Rand plans to attack them with the goal of pushing the Shan-Chan back into the sea. Rand secretly carries Kalandor, retrieved by Narishma. Rand's army is fairly small compared to the Shan-Chan, only about 6,000 men. They're a fairly diverse group of Saldeans, Ilion, and Tyran forces represented. Bashir is Rand's closest advisor, but most of the rulers present are actually those Rand wants to keep an eye on, such as Wayraman, Anayala, and Ailil. A large group of those following Rand specifically are called the Legion of the Dragon. They each carry a short sword and a crossbow and do not head cavalry or pikes. Many in the Legion are men who approached the Black Tower and were turned away. Despite their small numbers, there are many Ashman present, making this army quite formidable. Rand's plan is to use short-distance traveling to harry the Shan-Shan through the mountains. Winter storms cause mud and the terrain is challenging, both steep and forested, which is terrible for cavalry, but great for the Legion of the Dragon. Moreover, the Ashamon's healing keeps Rand's attrition relatively low, as most wounded are able to recover, so long as they're found in time. Rand is nearly killed in the mountains multiple times. First, Idrim Pedros tries to assassinate him and narrowly misses due to some birds, reminiscent of Nynaeve being saved from Moghedien by some random birds. The second time, Weiramon is out of position at a key moment, allowing Shan-Shan to break through to Rand. Rand attributes this to incompetence on Weiremon's part, but I think we should also consider deliberate sabotage. While Rand is wounded, Anayela and Ailil briefly consider abandoning him or even murdering him. Both the Ashaman and the Damane in Ebodar feel that Sidon and Saidar are strange. The Damane seem to be sick, while the Ashaman describe Sidon as being eager. As the Shan-Shan do not yet know about traveling, they vastly overestimate the size of Rand's forces. Rand underestimates the ability of the Rakan to scout and is surprised to find the Shan-Shan at Ebodar well prepared for him. As the Shan-Shan general, Mirage, has fought in battles with Damane on both sides before, he is tactically prepared to fight Ashaman. Despite Rand's victories in the mountains, this battle is terribly lopsided, around 40,000 to 6,000, and those 6,000 have been fighting in the mountains for days. Rand's losses are extreme, at least 500 for Bashir and at least 700 for Rand, with multiple Ashaman lost as well. The losses for the Shan-Shan are far greater, but they had many more to lose. Bashir urges Rand to turn back. They've successfully pushed the Shan-Shan back to Ebodar and inflicted severe casualties. With traveling, the retreat will be swift and relatively safe. Rand pridefully takes up Kalandor, screaming, "Come against me if you dare, I am the storm. Come if you dare, Shaitan, I am the dragon reborn," and calling down thousands of lightning bolts indiscriminately, killing many of his own people before Bashir knocks Kalandor from his hand. This is Rand's first real defeat. The Shan-Shan also consider this encounter to be a defeat, the second defeat of the ever-victorious army on these shores. Even Mirage, their general, is killed. The Maidens are furious to have been left out of yet another battle. They beat Rand, which he sees as a fair response. Rand seeks Ketsuan's service as his advisor. Rand is not happy about needing her help and tries everything he can to bully her into submission before finally, begrudgingly, allowing Ketsuan to set some terms. She will not need to swear an oath to him like some of the other Aes Sedai have, and he will be polite when speaking to her. Ketsuan reveals that Kalandor is a flawed sangreal. It has no limit on it, and it makes the taint much stronger. Rand can only safely use it by linking with two women and allowing one of them to direct the circle. Rand and Min are apparently attacked at Rand's apartments in Curium by a man wielding the One Power. Rand has Fedwin Moore, one of the first to accept his amnesty and learn to channel, and one of the very few people Rand trusts with his life, protect Min while he hunts the attacker. Dashiva, Gedwin, and Rochad betray Rand. Dashiva attacks him, and Rand only survives by creating a protective cocoon he pulled from Luce Theron. The men flee. Rand hunts for them for hours, but can't find anything. When he finally returns to Min, he finds that Fedwin has gone mad and has mentally reverted to childhood. Min had to talk him into playing with wooden blocks so that he wouldn't pull down the walls to build a tower to keep her safe. Rand euthanizes Fedwin in just the saddest scene ever, even surprising time at how hard Rand has become. Dashiva, Gedwin, Rochad, Torval, and Kismet have all deserted. Time is particularly surprised and enraged to hear that Dashiva is among them. Min notes that Rand still does not cry even after the truly heartbreaking scene with Fedwin Moore. Moving on to Tar-Valon. Elayne is still submitting to Elviarans, signing many proclamations seemingly meant to turn the Aja against each other. Elaida is made to swear a daily litany to obey Elviaran and is given a harsh beating for disobeying her. Masana didn't order Elviaran to do all this, but she's kind of allowing it. The towers become very antagonistic and paranoid, with sisters of a particular Aja staying together and fearing to walk into another Aja's territory. San and Pivara are continuing to hunt for the Black Aja. They've been using the Oath Rod to force sisters to swear to obey them, then swear that they are not a Dark Friend, if they can. They promise to free them if they're not Dark Friends, but they don't specify when, and they're actually holding onto this oath for quite a while. While trying to find Dark Friends, San and Pivara accidentally discover that Zera is one of those sent from Saladar to ensure that everyone knows about the Red's plot with Loghain. From her, they learn the names of all 10 sent. When Zera is commanded to admit that this is a lie, we learn that a person caught between two conflicting oaths will choke and die if the paradox isn't resolved. 4 other sisters, Dosine, Yukiti, Siren, and Teline, discover San and Pivara with the Oath Rod. Through the discussion, Teline is accidentally revealed to be a Dark Friend. Tovine Ghazal, who is leading the attack in the Black Tower, finally arrives and is just immediately incapacitated. Loghain apparently seems to bond her. She cannot disobey him and even has no desire to do so. In frustration, she turns her anger on Elaida, vowing to make Elaida pay, if Loghain ever lets her. Moving on to Perrin. Perrin is continuing a secret mission from the last book, to put a leash on the Prophet. He leads a tripartite camp of Manor Winged Guard, Aiel, and Two Rivers men. He has Grady and Niall, two Asha'man, with him as well. Berlin leads the Manors. Tensions are still high, due in part to the Aiel Wise Ones treating the Aes Sedai as apprentices. Perrin saves Morgase's party from some dragon swarm. She's going by the name Mygdin, and nobody seems to have recognized her yet, though Perrin does recognize Gil traveling with her. Balwer is also still around, and he immediately starts helping Perrin, who quickly sees his worth. Faile takes Mygdin's party on as servants. Elias joins Perrin's camp, having heard of his status from wolves and figuring that Perrin might need a friend and an ally. Elias proves immediately useful by quickly giving Perrin some marriage advice on the expectations of Seldian women, which works really well. As Elias explains, Faile's been interpreting Perrin's gentle treatment as a lack of faith in her, as though she's too weak for him to speak his mind. Recall too that Elias used to be a warder, and his Aes Sedai, Rena, is still alive. She has blurred their bonds, so he can't really tell where she is or what she's feeling, but they both can feel that the other's alive. If anyone recognizes him as a fled warder, then it'll be a problem. Faile has a group of Kyrianan followers of Jaeto serving her. They call their society Cha Faile, the Falcon's Talon. Faile comes up with a scheme to continue flying the banner of Manetheren as camouflage. Everyone will assume that Perrin is just some upstart trying to resurrect Manetheren, not seeing his true mission. Masema is in Abila. The Wise Ones and Aes Sedai want Perrin to simply kill him, but Rand wants Perrin to try to use him. Perrin meets with Alliandre, Queen of Geldon. Recall that the Prophet has been pressuring Geldon quite a lot, and there's been some major turnover lately. Alliandre doesn't have much power. Perrin makes kind of an ass of himself while meeting with her, but she swears an oath of fealty to him anyways, and claims to have interpreted Perrin's awkwardness as shrewd maneuvering. Perrin meets with Masema, who seems and smells insane. Masema refuses to travel as he refuses to be touched by the One Power, but he agrees to mundanely travel to meet with the Lord Dragon, may his name be blessed in the light. While Perrin is meeting with Masema, Cha Faile learns that Masema has met with the Shanshan. Faile needs to warn him, but before she can, her group is waylaid by Shaido, who are out capturing more slaves for Savannah. Faile, Mygdin, Alliandre, Arella, Lasil, Bain, and Chiad are all taken Gaishan. Berlin may have escaped, which would make her the only hope of warning Perrin that Masema has met with the Shanshan and may have even formed an alliance of sorts with them. Alright, Egwene. Egwene starts the book off in pretty much the same position as she was in the last book. She's still Amyrlin, but with very little power, as the Hall, particularly Ramonda and Elayne, vie for control. Egwene's forces are severely slowed by winter, and she is struggling to pay for everything. But the army has grown to greater than 30,000 people, and they are approaching Tar Valon. She considers Brynn to be one of her most trustworthy allies. A coalition of Andorans and Mirandians have formed an army to Egwene's north and are approaching. Egwene secretly arranges a meeting with their representatives. When Ramonda and Elayne find out, they're furious, and each demand to lead the meeting. At that meeting, Egwene surprises the Hall by not passing the conversation to either Ramonda or Elayne. She still isn't really seen as the Amyrlin, as most of the conversation is still directed past her to the sitters, but she is the main person who speaks. She proclaims that the Book of Novices is open to any women who want to be tested, regardless of age. At this meeting, she also finds a little bit of time to briefly talk with Telmaines, convincing him not to keep the band in Murindi and become mercenaries. After the meeting, Egwene knows that Ramonda and Elayne will act, but she doesn't give them the chance. She calls a formal meeting of the Hall and immediately makes a motion to declare war on Elaida. The motion passes, after which Egwene reveals that the law of war states, quote, "As one set of hands must guide a sword, so the Amyrlin seat shall direct and prosecute the war by decree. She shall seek the advice of the Hall of the Tower, but the Hall shall carry out her decrees with all possible speed, and for the sake of unity, they shall and must approve any decree of the Amyrlin seat regarding prosecution of the war with the greater consensus." This doesn't give Egwene unlimited power, but it does solidify her authority to direct the war itself. Egwene declares that they will rest for 1 month, as advised by Brynn. Then they will begin the siege of Tar Valon. 1 month later, Egwene notes that they have more novices now than ever, nearly 1,000. One of them, a grandmother named Sharina, has a potential above even that of Nynaeve. In the last scene of the book, Egwene is a full circle of 13 create a gateway 10 paces tall and 100 paces wide to begin the siege of Tar Valon. And finally, we have Mat, who is presumably still waiting for Dorothy to steal his slippers, buried under a building in Ebodar. Or, more likely, he's been shipped back to Shanshan. Alright, so much like Egwene's forces trudging through mud in the late come winter, we're in the Slog now. Before I get into our main point for today, I'd like to briefly address the Slog, as I've been hearing that books 8 through 10 are the Slog for quite a while now. Last time, while discussing A Crown of Swords, I mentioned that Book 7 is the first book in the Wheel of Time that feels like a middle book to me. I didn't mean that it was unenjoyable or poorly written, just that it didn't really feel as much like an atomic, self-contained narrative as the books that came before it. This is much more pronounced in The Path of Daggers. Our main perspective characters, Elayne, Perrin, Egwene, and Rand, hardly interact with each other at all. There's no mad dash to a climax that somehow pulls all of our threads together either. Each of our POVs has their own sort of climax, and none of them really feel as spectacular as we've come to expect. though there is a serious laconic thrill in Egwene's simple, "It has begun," as her massive gateway created by a full circle of 13 opens to begin the siege of Tar-Valon. Plenty of stuff, good stuff, happens in this book, but it doesn't really work as a standalone story at all. But it didn't really move slowly at all, at least for me. I love the description of circles and the channeling on the Bowl of the Winds. Rand's week-long campaign against the Shan-Shan and Ebodar was brutal. We have our first real example of a man succumbing to the madness of the Taint. We also learn what's up with Callandor. Egwene is formally at war with Elaida, and the siege is set to begin the next book. This is all really thrilling stuff. I seriously tried to rationalize combining the posts for this book and the next one just so I could jump right into Winter's Heart without delay. The Path of Daggers is also pretty short, at least for the Wheel of Time. Only 31 chapters and a prologue, where most of the other books have had 50 plus chapters. The chapters aren't really longer either. The book is just a couple hundred pages shorter than I've kind of come to expect. It was easily the quickest read for me. I actually would have had this video out several days sooner, but I got a COVID booster and it really knocked me on my ass for like 3 or 4 days. For someone reading these books now, after they've all been published, it's hardly a slog at all. I'm just excited for the next book. But I have to imagine that it would have been extremely frustrating to read this in October of 1998 and then have to wait until November of 2000 for the next book. To computers at the time, that's almost a century in the past. So in 2022, this feels fine, but I probably do think that historically this would have been a slog. So I guess I get calling it the slog, even if it doesn't really feel that way to somebody reading it today. Side note, I actually was really surprised to learn that most of the Wheel of Time books only took 1 to 2 years to write. That seems really, really quick for extremely dense fantasy novels like this. But with that out of the way, let's get to the point. On the heights, the paths are paved with daggers. Once again, our main point is mostly in the title. Taken metaphorically, as clearly intended, this proverb refers to the precariousness of power. We see this in the rise and fall of queens. Well, they're not all queens, but it sounds cooler. Taken literally, kind of cheekily, Rand also wages an intense week-long campaign against the Shan-Shan through the mountains between Elayne and Ebodar, literally in the heights. So let's discuss these two things separately. Back when I talked about the fires of heaven, my theme was high and low. The point there was that we saw both the top and the bottom of society, the powerful and the powerless. This time around, things are different. A throneless queen isn't the same as a poor farmer. She may be as poor, but she's still inherently important. Likewise, success for a queen might not always look like an increase in wealth and power. We're not talking about the 99% versus the 1% here. We're talking about the 0.01%. Continuing what she started in the last book, we really get to see Elayne take charge in the Path of Daggers. From one perspective, this is just a practical matter. Alliandre would struggle to lead the Aes Sedai and the Kin because she's Aiel, and because she's not as powerful as Nynaeve or Elayne and would have less respect amongst the Aes Sedai. And although Nynaeve has some real experience leading, and she's plenty powerful, she also just got married and just broke her block, so she's kind of distracted. She's also slowly being forced to confront the fact that what worked for her as Wisdom of Edmund's Field might not really work on people accustomed to far greater levels of power. Given how much support Perrin got when he was first leading, I also have to wonder whether Nynaeve was getting a lot more support than she realized. So that really just leaves Elayne, as our heroes certainly aren't going to leave things up to anyone else. From another perspective, I think we're also just seeing Elayne start to psych herself up for becoming Queen of Andor. Elayne taking a leadership position began shortly after she first learned that her mother is dead. She always knew that she would be queen someday, but once it became a matter of days rather than someday, it became much more real to her. And it goes pretty well. Wrangling the Aes Sedai, Athan Mir, and Kin isn't completely smooth, but Elayne does about as good a job as I could really imagine under the circumstances. We also get to finally see her enter Caemlyn and express her claim to the throne to Dylan. I'm actually not sure whether Elayne fully grasps how critical that short conversation with Dylan was. Pay close attention to Dylan's words here. Elayne turned slowly to face Dylan Terabin as the golden-haired woman walked the length of the Grand Hall. Dylan had been one of her mother's earliest supporters in her own quest for the throne. There was more gray in her hair than Elayne remembered, more lines at the corners of her eyes. She was still quite beautiful, a strong woman, and powerful as friend or foe. She stopped at the foot of the dais, looking up. "I've been hearing for 2 days that you were alive, but I didn't really believe it until now. You've come to accept the throne from the Dragon Reborn, then?" "I claim the throne of my own right, Dylan, with my own hand. The Lion Throne is no bauble to be accepted from a man." Dylan nodded, as at self-evident truth, which it was to any Andoran. "How do you stand, Dylan? With Trakand or against? I have heard your name often on my way here. Since you claim your throne by your own right, with." Few people could sound as dry as she. Elayne sat down on the top step and motioned the older woman to join her. "There are a few obstacles, of course," Dylan went on as she gathered her blue skirts to sit. There have been several claimants already, as you may know. Nian and Elayne, different spelling, I have securely locked up, on a charge of treason that most people seem willing to accept, for the time being. Elayne's husband is still active for her, though quietly, and Amarilla has announced a claim, the silly goose. She's getting support of a kind, but nothing that need worry you. Your real worries, aside from Aiel all over the city waiting for the Dragon Reborn to come back, are Aemlyn, Erethel, and Pelivar. For the moment, Luan and Elorian will be behind you, but they may go over to those three. A very succinct list, delivered in a tone suitable for discussing a possible horse trade. Nan and Elayne she knew about, if not that Jared still thought his wife had a chance at the throne. Amarilla was a goose to believe that she would be accepted, whatever her support. The last 5 names were worrying, though. Each had been as strong a supporter of her mother as had Dylan, and each led a strong house. So Erethel and Aemlyn want the throne, Elayne muttered. I can't believe it of Elorian, not for herself. Pelivar might be acting for one of his daughters, but Luan only had granddaughters, none near old enough. You spoke as if they might unite, all 5 houses. Behind whom? That would be a dire threat. Smiling, Dylan propped her chin in her hand. They seem to think I should have the throne. Now, what do you intend about the Dragon Reborn? He hasn't been back here in some time, but he can pop out of the air, it seems. Elayne squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, but when she opened them, she was still sitting on the steps of the dais in the Grand Hall, and Dylan was still smiling at her. Her brother fought for Elaida, and her half-brother was a White Cloak. She had filled the palace with women who might turn on one another at any moment, not to mention the fact that one was a Dark Friend, maybe even Black Aja. And the strongest threat she faced in claiming the throne, a very strong one, stood behind a woman who said she supported Elayne. The world was quite mad. She might as well add her bit. I mean to bond him as my warder, she said, and went on before the other woman could more than blink in astonishment. I also hope to marry him. Those things have nothing to do with the Lime Throne, however. The very first thing I intend. As she went on, Dylan began to laugh. Elayne wished she knew whether it was from delight over her plans or because Dylan saw her own path to the Lime Throne being made smooth. At least she knew what she faced, now. What Elayne notes as dryness in Dylan's tone, of course she's not going to accept the throne from Rand or any man, really seems significant here. Juxtapose Elayne's rise to power with Egwene's. Egwene is gutsy as hell, but that in itself isn't what propelled her to the heights. Egwene's guts enabled her to perform some spectacular schemes to force other women into an impossible position. She's playing a very aggressive game of chess, but she's winning by the rules. Ramonda doesn't fall in line out of awe for Egwene's force of will. Ramonda was defeated, legally, by Egwene's superior maneuvering, and Egwene will only continue to stay in power so long as she can maintain this advantage. I don't want to overstress this point, but it's important to understand that though Egwene has a forceful will, that is not in itself what's keeping her where she is. Elayne, on the other hand, is leading by nobility and grace. In the last book, she made a decent argument to the Aes Sedai, but I don't actually think they acquiesced because of a legal need. They could have come up with any number of excuses to ignore or distract from Elayne's argument. Despite her age, they saw Elayne conducting herself as a woman worthy of respect and obedience. Now, and even Elayne had been kind of acting as though being granted the shawl was sufficient to be treated as Aes Sedai, which is exactly what the other Aes Sedai were afraid of. Imagine, for example, if instead of Elayne confidently asserting her argument, the exact same points had been made by Tom trying to protect her. I truly doubt that the Aes Sedai would have seen the merit of his points and fallen in line behind Elayne because of the legal necessity. No, what brought them into line was Elayne's queenly manner. Likewise, with Dylan, that Elayne didn't seem to fully grasp that she was interviewing for the position with Dylan, that she was just asserting her will without any scheming or guile, was actually to her benefit. As we can see from Elayne's thoughts, she isn't making a calculated political decision to claim the throne by her own authority in order to avoid the appearance of being Rand's puppet, and her plans for what to do with Rand in the future sound almost ludicrously entitled. Well, good. That's what Dylan is looking for. I think Dylan was testing whether Elayne had the right manner for an Andoran queen. If Elayne had entered without respecting tradition, perhaps dressed as a queen and sitting on the throne, then Dylan would have seen her as a child. If Elayne had wavered or schemed in response to Dylan's question, "You've come to accept the throne from the Dragon Reborn then Dylan would have seen her as a child. It's the Lion Throne, not the spoiled princess throne or the Dragon Reborn's girlfriend's throne. If Dylan had seen anything other than a lion, I think she would have made her own. Fortunately, Elayne is a lion at heart. Entitled, arrogant, and fierce. Not all characteristics I'd necessarily consider virtuous, but they're exactly what's expected of an Andoran queen. Elayne's not sure what Dylan's laughter at her plans for Rand means, but I think I know. She saw that Elayne's going to make this happen, regardless of how ridiculous it sounds. But let's get back to Egwene for a minute. Alright, so Egwene's stuff this book was pretty awesome, and I'm going to try to take it seriously, but It's honestly really hard not to constantly imagine her great victory in invoking the law of war as Jar Jar proposing a vote to grant her emergency powers to construct a clone army. Seriously though, she played a real close game with this, and any number of things could have gone wrong. Forget Rand's iron resolve, Egwene's got nerves of steel. A question of war cannot be shelved, Egwene said in a carrying tone. It must be answered before any question called after it. That is the law. Quick, questioning glances passed between sitters. Is that so? Janya said finally. Squinting thoughtfully, she twisted on her bench to address the woman next to her. Takima, you remember everything you read, and I'm sure I remember you saying that you read the Law of War. Is that what it says? Egwene held her breath. The White Tower had sent soldiers to any number of wars over the last 1,000 years, but always in response to a plea for help from at least 2 thrones, and it always had been their war, not the Tower's. The last time the Tower itself actually declared war had been against Archer Hawkwing. Swan said that now only a few librarians knew much more than that there was a Law of War. Short, with long dark hair to her waist and skin the color of aged ivory, Takima often reminded people of a bird, tilting her head in thought. Now she looked like a bird that wanted to take flight, shifting on her seat, adjusting her shawl, unnecessarily straightening her cap of pearls and sapphires. It is, she said finally, and clamped her mouth shut. Egwene quietly started breathing again. It seems, Ramonda said in a clipped tone, that Swan Sanche has been teaching you well, mother. How speak you in support of declaring war on a woman? She sounded as if she were trying to push something disagreeable out of her way, and she dropped onto her seat, waiting for it to depart. Egwene nodded graciously anyway, and rose. She met the sitters' gazes one by one, levelly, firmly. Takima avoided her eyes. Light, the woman knew, but she had not said anything. Would she hold silent long enough? It was too late to change plans. Today, we find ourselves confronted by an army led by people who doubt us. That army would not be there otherwise. Egwene wanted to put passion to her voice, to let it burst out, but Swan had advised utter coolness, and finally she had agreed. They needed to see a woman in control of herself, not a girl being ridden by her heart. The words came from her heart, though. You heard Arethel say she did not want to become entangled in Aes Sedai affairs, yet they were willing to bring an army into Murundi and stand in our way, because they are not certain who we are or what we are about. Did any of you feel that they truly believe you are sitters? Melland, round-faced and fierce-eyed, shifted on her bench among the greens, and so did Salida, twitching her yellow-fringed shawl, though her dark face managed to hide any expression. Barana, another sitter chosen in Salidar, frowned thoughtfully. Egwene did not mention the reaction to her as Amyrlin. If that thought was not already in their heads, she did not want to plant it there. We've listed Elida's crimes to countless nobles, she went on. We've told them we intend to remove her, but they doubt. They say that maybe we are what we say, and maybe there's a trick in our words. Perhaps we are only Elida's hand, weaving some elaborate scheme. Doubt leaves people floundering. Doubt gave Pelvar and Arethel the nerve to stand before Aes Sedai and say, you cannot go further. Who else will stand in our way or interfere because they aren't certain, and uncertainty leads them to act in a cloud of confusion. There is only one way for us to dispel their confusion. We have already done everything else. Once we declare ourselves at war with Elida, there can be no doubts. I don't say that Arethel and Pelvar and Amyrlin will march away as soon as we do, but they and everyone else will know who we are. No one will dare again to show doubt so openly when you say you are the Hall of the Tower. No one will dare stand in our way, meddling in the affairs of the Tower through uncertainty and ignorance. We have walked to the door and put our hands on the latch. If you are afraid to walk through, then you all but ask the world to believe you are nothing but Elida's puppets. She sat, surprised at how calm she felt. Beyond the 2 rows of sitters, sisters outside stirred, putting their heads together. She could imagine the excited murmurs that Eladrin's ward blocked off. Now if only Takima kept her mouth shut long enough. Ramonda grunted impatiently and stood only long enough to say, Who stands for declaring war against Elida? Her gaze returned to Elayne, and her cold, smug smile returned. It was clear what she considered important, once this nonsense was done with. Janya rose immediately, the long brown fringe in her shawl swaying. We might as well, she said. She was not supposed to speak, but her set jaw and sharp gaze dared anyone to call her down. She was not normally so forceful, but as usual, her words nearly tripped over one another. Mending what the world knows won't be any harder than it is for this. Well, I don't see the point of waiting. On the other side of Takima, Esmeralda nodded and stood. Moria all but bounded to her feet, frowning down at Lirel, who gathered her skirts as if to rise, then hesitated and looked at Elayne questioningly. Elayne was too busy frowning across the carpets at Ramonda to notice. Among the greens, Samelin and Melin stood together, and Faile looked up with a jerk. A stocky, copper-skinned Domani, Faile was not a woman startled by much, but she looked startled now, her square face swinging wide-eyed from Samelin to Melind and back. Selida rose, carefully adjusting the yellow fringe of her shawl and just as carefully avoiding Ramonda's sudden frown. Quamessa stood, and then Eladrin, drawing Barana up by her sleeve. Delana twisted completely around on her bench, peering at the sisters outside. Even in silence, the spectators' excitement communicated itself in constant shifting, heads going together, eyes darting towards the sitters. Delana rose slowly, both hands pressed to her middle, looking ready to sick up on the spot. Takima grimaced and stared at her hands on her knees. Soroya studied the other two white sitters, tugging at her ear the way she did when deep in thought, but no one else moved to stand. Egwene felt bile rising in her own throat. 10. Just 10. She had been so sure. Swan had been so sure. Loghain alone should have been enough, given their ignorance of the law involved. Pelivar's army and Arethel refusing to admit that they were sitters should have primed them like a pump. For the love of the light, Moria burst out. Rounding on Narelle and Elayne, she planted her fists on her hips. If Janya's speaking had gone against custom, this tied it in a knot. Displays of anger were strictly forbidden in the hall, but Moria's eyes blazed and her Illianer accent was thick with it. Why do you wait? Elaida did steal the stole and the staff. Elaida's Aja did make Loghain a false dragon. Only the light knows how many other men. No woman in the history of the tower did ever deserve this declaration more. Stand or hold silent from now about your resolve to remove her. Lelaine did not quite stare, but by her expression, you might have thought she found herself attacked by a sparrow. This is hardly worth a vote, Moria, she said in a tight voice. We will speak later about decorum, you and I. Still, if you need a demonstration of resolve. With a sharp sniff, she rose and gave a jerk of her head that pulled Narelle to her feet like strings. Lelaine seemed surprised that it did not pull up Faile and Takima too. Far from standing, Takima grunted as if struck. Disbelief bright on her face, she ran her eyes along the women in the feet, obviously counting, and then did it again. Takima, who remembered everything the first time. Egwene breathed deep in relief. It was done. She could hardly believe. After a moment, she cleared her throat, and Sheriam actually jumped. Green eyes as big as teacups, the keeper cleared her throat too. The lesser consensus standing, war is declared against Elaida do Everine Arohan. Her voice was none too steady, but it sufficed. In the interest of unity, I asked for the greater consensus to stand. Faile half moved, then clenched her hands in her lap. Soroya opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking, her face troubled. No one else stirred. You won't get it, Ramonda said flatly. The sneer she directed across the pavilion at Lelaine was as good as a statement of why she, at least, would not stand. Now that little business is finished, we can go on with, I don't think we can, Egwene cut in. Takima, what does the law of war say about the Amyrlin seat? Ramonda was left with her mouth hanging open. Takima's lips writhed. The diminutive brown looked more than ever a bird wishing to take flight. The law, she began, then took a deep breath and sat up straight. The law of war states, as one set of hands must guide a sword, so the Amyrlin seat shall direct and prosecute the war by decree. She shall seek the advice of the Hall of the Tower, but the Hall shall carry out her decrees with all possible speed, and for the sake of unity, they shall... She faltered and had to visibly force herself to go on. They shall and must approve any decree of the Amyrlin seat regarding prosecution of the war with the greater consensus. A long silence stretched. Every eye seemed to be goggling. Turning abruptly, Delana vomited onto the carpets behind her bench. Quamessa and Selita both climbed down and started towards her, but she waved them off, plucking a scarf from her sleeve to wipe her mouth. Magla and Soroya and several others still seated looked as though they might follow her example. No others who had been chosen in Saladar, though. Ramonda appeared ready to bite through a nail. Very clever, Lelaine said at last in clipped tones, and after a deliberate pause added, Mother, will you tell us what the great wisdom of your vast experience tells you to do? About the war, I mean. I want to make myself clear. Let me make myself clear too, Egwene said coldly. Leaning forward, she fixed the blue sitter sternly. A certain degree of respect is required towards the Amyrlin seat, and from now on I will have it, daughter. This is no time for me to have to unchair you in name of penance. Lelaine's eyes crept wider and wider with shock. Had the woman really believed everything would continue as before? Or, after so long not daring to show more than the tiniest of backbone, had Lelaine simply believed she had none? Egwene really did not want to unchair her. The blues would almost certainly return the woman, and she still had to deal with the Hall on matters that could not be convincingly disguised as part of the war against Elaida. From the corner of her eye, she saw a smile pass across Ramonda's lips at seeing Lelaine set down. Small profit if all she did was raise Ramonda's stock with the others. That holds for everyone, Ramonda, she said. If need be, Tiana can find 2 birches as easily as 1. Ramonda's smile vanished abruptly. If I may speak, Mother, Takima said, rising slowly. She attempted to smile, but she still looked decidedly ill. I myself think you have begun well. There may be benefits to stopping here a month. Or longer. Ramonda's head jerked around to stare at her, but for once Takima did not appear to notice. Wintering here, we can avoid worse weather farther north, and also plan carefully. There is an end to delays, daughter, Egwene cut in. No more dragging our feet. Would she be another Gara or another Shine? Either was still possible. In 1 month, we will travel from here. No, she was Egwene Alvier, and whatever the secret histories would say of her faults and virtues, the light only knew, but they would be hers, not copies of some other woman's. In 1 month, we will begin the siege of Tar Valon. This time, the silence was broken only by the sound of Takuma weeping. Egwene's goal was to invoke the law of war to give herself total authority over matters relating to the war, but that only works if there is a war, which the Aes Sedai really didn't want. She couldn't just bully them into declaring war, as they'd simply refuse. She also couldn't declare war unanimously. Egwene isn't, say, a US president who might be able to get away with saying something on television or sending orders directly to the military without giving Congress time to respond until it's too late. Even if Brim was willing to obey an order to make an overt act of war without the approval of the Hall, it would take far too long to mobilize. Egwene would be deposed before anything happened that couldn't be taken back. Even sending a declaration of war in a letter to Elaida would have been pretty easy to undo. And again, the Aes Sedai really didn't want to actually go to war. They wanted to make a show of force, but most of the rebels are still hoping for some way to resolve things peacefully. If not for Swan's involvement, they'd still be lounging around in Saladar, and they'd still be looking for any excuse to delay and pray for a miracle. They're likely hoping that arriving with Bryn's soldiers will simply force the White Tower to meet them on more equal terms. Perhaps the Aes Sedai and Tar Valon would be willing to lay all the blame on Elaida if it meant resolving matters peacefully. The rebel Aes Sedai likely don't know about Elviarin's scheming to turn the Aja against each other, which would probably make peaceful resolution even more difficult. So Egwene had to manipulate the Hall into agreeing to a war that they didn't want. Well, what did the Aes Sedai fear even more than war with the Tower? And that's where Egwene strikes. She knew that the Andoran and Mirandian coalition wouldn't see them as truly representing the Aes Sedai. The White Tower and the Ageless Faces are so tied up in the identity of the Aes Sedai that Egwene could easily predict how she would be received. All she had to do was apply a little bit of rhetoric to ensure the Hall didn't interpret this as a lack of respect for Egwene, but for them all instead. Of course, that wouldn't likely have been enough. The Hall really didn't want to go to war. Here, Egwene plays what I think is the most precarious card she has, relying on the Hall's arrogance, and a fair bit of luck. If Ramonda or Elayne were more familiar with the law of war, or if Takuma had spoken up, then Egwene's plan would have fallen apart. The Hall never would have agreed to war if they knew that Egwene would have full authority to it. If they hadn't been so arrogant, they would have been a lot more cautious too. Egwene was clearly up to something. But Ramonda was so confident that she could simply put Egwene in her place, and so impatient to get on to the real work of solidifying her own position, that she didn't stop to consider what was happening. Ramonda clearly thought that she could simply agree to the war, solidify her own position, then undo it, either by simply undoing the decision in the privacy of the Hall before anyone else even finds out, or by dragging her feet and waiting for a chance for peace before the real conflict could begin. Or perhaps Ramonda is even personally okay with a war as long as it's run by Ramonda. But Egwene won. She's in charge now. Note that she declares that they'll wait the full month, which is what Bryn recommended. In general, Egwene is perfectly willing to trust Bryn's expertise when it comes to waging war. Egwene decides on the strategic goals herself, but she knows to leave the logistics and presumably the tactics to Bryn. As we'll discuss shortly, Rand does not share this wisdom, treating Bashir as more of an advisor than a general. So those are our rising queens, but how do the Heights treat those who stumble? Let's talk about Alliandre, Faile, and Morgase. So, alright, Faile isn't a queen, but she will be if Tenobi and Bashir both die, so close enough. And before we talk about Alliandre, we need a brief refresher on Galladon. We've been hearing about war and madness in Galladon since Ped and Fain first arrived in Emond's Field in The Peddler, Chapter 3 of The Eye of the World. It's literally the scene where we first started talking about false dragons. Later, but still in Book 1, we learned that Logain was the false dragon in Galladon. Galladon and Amadicia are also where Masema, the prophet, found a following. We've been hearing about Alliandre's difficulties in containing the prophet's army since the prologue to Book 5, The Fires of Heaven. The first time we see Alliandre, Nynaeve is waiting to meet with Masema to ask about a boat, which, if you recall, doesn't go super well. The skinny guard, if such he was, he had no weapon, so perhaps he was not trusted either, seemed to have no objection when she moved to where she could see through the doorway. The man and woman inside could not have been more different. Masema had shaved even his topknot, and his coat was plain brown wool, heavily wrinkled but clean, although his knee-high boots were scuffed. Deep-set eyes turned his permanently sour look to a scowl, and a scar made a pale triangle on his dark cheek, a near mirror image of Raghan's, only more faded with age and a hair near the eye. The woman, in elegantly gold-embroidered blue silk, was short of her middle years and quite lovely despite a nose perhaps too long for beauty. A simple blue net cap gathered her dark hair, spilling almost to her waist, but she wore a broad necklace of gold and fire drops with a matching bracelet, and gemmed rings decorated nearly every finger. Where Masema seemed poised to rush at something, teeth bared, she bore herself with stately reserve and grace. "So many followers wherever you go," she was saying. "That order flies over the wall when you arrive. People are not safe in themselves or their property. The Lord Dragon has broken all bonds of law, all bonds made by mortal men and women. Masema's voice was heated but intense, not angry. The prophecies say that the Lord Dragon will break all chains that bind, and it is so. The Lord Dragon's radiance will protect us against the shadow. It is not the shadow that threatens here, but cut purses and slip fingers and head crackers. Some who follow you, many, believe that they can take what they wish from whoever has it without payment or leave. There is justice in the hereafter, when we are born again. Concern with things of this world is useless, but very well. If you wish earthly justice, his lip curled contemptuously, let it be this. Henceforth, a man who steals will have his right hand cut off. A man who interferes with a woman or insults her honor or commits murder will be hung. A woman who steals or commits murder will be flogged. If any accuses and finds 12 who agree, it will be done. Let it be so. As you say, of course, the woman murmured. Aloof elegance remained on her face, but she sounded shaken. Nynaeve did not know how Ghealdan law ran, but she did not think it could be so casual as that. The woman took a deep breath. There is still the matter of food. It becomes difficult to feed so many. Every man, woman, and child who has come to the Lord Dragon must have a full belly. It must be so. Where gold can be found, food can be found, and there is too much gold in the world. Too much concern with gold. Masema's head swung angrily, not anger with her, but in general. He looked to be searching for those who concern themselves with gold so he can unleash fury on their heads. The Lord Dragon has been reborn. The shadow hangs over the world, and only the Lord Dragon can save us. Only belief in the Lord Dragon, submission and obedience to the word of the Lord Dragon. All else is useless, even where it is not blasphemy. Blessed be the name of the Lord Dragon in the light. It had the sound of a rote reply. It is no longer simply a matter of gold, my Lord Prophet. Finding and transporting food is sufficient. I am not a lord, he broke in again, and now he was angry. He leaned towards the woman, spittle on his lips, and though her face did not change, her hands twitched as they wanted to clutch her dress. There is no lord but the Lord Dragon, in whom the light dwells, and I am but one humble voice of the Lord Dragon. Remember that. High or low, blasphemers earn the scourge. Forgive me, the begemmed woman murmured, spreading her skirts in a curtsy fit for a queen's court. It is as you say, of course. There is no lord save the Lord Dragon, and I am but a humble follower of the Lord Dragon. Blessed be the name of the Lord Dragon, who comes to hear the wisdom and guidance of the prophet. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Masema was suddenly cold. You wear too much gold. Do not let earthly possessions seduce you. Gold is dross. The Lord Dragon is all. Immediately she began plucking rings from her fingers, and before the second was off, the weedy fellow scurried to her side, pulling a pouch from his coat pocket and holding it for her to drop them in. The bracelet and her necklace followed as well. Nynaeve looked at Uno and raised an eyebrow. Every penny goes to the poor, he told her in a low voice that barely reached her ear. Or somebody who needs it. If some merchant hadn't bloody given him her house, he'd be in a bloody stable or one of those huts outside the city. Even his food comes as a gift, Ragan said just as quietly. They used to bring him dishes fit for a king until they learned he just gave away everything but a little bread and soup or stew. He hardly drinks wine now. Nynaeve shook her head. She supposed it was one way to find money for the poor, simply rob anyone who was not poor. Of course, that would just make everyone poor in the end, but it might work for a time. She wondered if Uno and Ragan knew the whole of it. People who claimed they were collecting money to help others often had a way of letting a good bit of it stick in their own pockets, or else they liked the power that spreading it about gave them, liked it far too much. She had a better feeling for the man who freely gave 1 copper from his own purse than the fellow who wrested a gold crown from someone else's, and less for fools who abandoned their farms and shops to follow this prophet, with no idea where their next meal would come from. Inside the room, the woman curtsied to Masema even more deeply than before, spreading her skirts wide and bowing her head. Until I once again have the honor of the prophet's words and counsel, the name of the Lord Dragon be blessed in the light. Masema waved her away absently, already half forgotten. He had seen them in the hall and was looking at them with as close to pleasure as his dour face could come. It was not very close. The woman swept on, not even appearing to see Nynaeve or the 2 men. Nynaeve sniffed as the weedy fellow in the red coat waved anxiously for them to come in. For someone who had just given up her jewelry on demand, that woman managed a fine queenly air. Skipping ahead, Nynaeve's actual meeting with Masema, which isn't relevant here. At least he didn't try to steal my jewelry, she said. Who was that fool woman who gave him hers? She could not have much sense if she had become one of Masema's followers. That, Uno said, was Alliandre, Blessed of the Light, Queen of Bloody Ghealdan, and a dozen more titles, the way you Southlanders like to pile them up. Nynaeve stubbed her toe on a cobblestone and almost fell. So that is how he does it, she exclaimed, shaking off their helping hands. If the Queen is fool enough to listen to him, no wonder he can do whatever he wants. Not a fool, Uno said sharply, flashing a frown at her before returning to watching the street. A wise woman. When you bloody find yourself straddling a wild horse, you bloody well ride it the way it's bloody going, if you're smart enough to pour water out of a bloody boot. You think she's a fool because Masema took her rings? She's flaming smart enough to know that he might demand more if she stopped wearing jewelry when she comes to him. The first time, he went to her, being the other way around since, and he did take the rings right off her flaming fingers. She had strands of pearls in her hair, and he broke the strings pulling them out. All of her ladies-in-waiting were down on their knees gathering the bloody things off the floor. Alliandre even picked a few herself. That doesn't sound so wise to me, she said stoutly. It sounds like cowardice. Whose knees were shaking because he looked at her? A voice in her head asked. Who was sweating herself silly? At least she had managed to face up to him. I did. Bending like a willow isn't the same as cowering like a mouse. Is she the queen or isn't she? The two men exchanged those irritating looks, and Ragnan said quietly, You don't understand, Nynaeve. Alliandre is the fourth to sit on the light-blessed throne since we came to Ghealdan, and that's barely half a year. Johannan wore the crown when Masema began attracting a few crowds, but he thought Masema a heartless madman and did nothing even when the crowds grew and his nobles told him he had to put an end to it. Johannan died in a hunting accident. Hunting accident? Uno interjected, sneering. A hawker who happened to be looking at him dropped his tray of pins and needles. Not unless he didn't know one bloody end of a flaming boar spear from the other. Flaming Southlanders and their flaming game of houses. And Elazel succeeded, Ragnan took up. She had the army dispersing the crowds until finally there was a pitched battle and it was the army that was chased off. Bloody poor excuse for soldiers, Uno muttered. She was going to have to speak to him about his language again. Ragnan nodded agreement, but went on with what he had been saying. They say Elazel took poison after that, but however she died, she was replaced by Teresia, who lasted a full 10 days after her coronation, just until she had a chance to send 2,000 soldiers against 10,000 folk who had gathered to hear Masema outside Johanna. After her soldiers were routed, she abdicated to marry a rich merchant. Nynaeve stared at him incredulously, and Uno snorted. That is what they say, the younger man maintained. Of course, in this land, marrying a commoner means giving up any claim to a throne forever, and whatever Baron Goriad feels about having a pretty young wife with royal blood, Arhi was dragged from his bed by a score of Alliandre's retainers and hauled to Jeddah Palace for a wedding in the small hours of the morning. Teresia went off to live on her husband's new country estate while Alliandre was being crowned, all before sunrise, and the new queen summoned Masema to the palace to tell him he would not be troubled again. Inside 2 weeks, she was calling on him. I do not know whether she really believes what he preaches, but I know she took the throne of a land on the edge of civil war, with white cloaks ready to move in, and she stopped it the only way she could. That is a wise queen, and a man could be proud to serve her, even if she is a Southlander. So that Alliandre is still queen at all is pretty goddamn impressive, and we would be wise not to make Nynaeve's mistake in reading weakness or cowardice in Alliandre's oath to Perrin. Quote, Under the light, she said firmly, looking up at him. I, Alliandre Maratha Kigaram, pledge my fealty and service to Lord Perrin Ibera of the Two Rivers, now and for all time, save that he chooses to release me of his own will. My lands and throne are his, and I yield them to his hand. So I do swear. For an instant there was a silence, broken only by Galena's gasp and the muted thud of his wine cup hitting the rug. Then Perrin heard Faile, once more whispering so softly no one next to her could have made out her words. Under the light, I do accept your pledge, and will defend and protect you and yours through battle's rack and winter's blast, and all that time may bring. The lands and throne of Ghealdan I give to you as my faithful vassal. Under the light, I do accept. That must have been the Isaldian manner of accepting. Thank the light she was too busy concentrating on him to see Elayne nodding at him as furiously, urging the same. The pair of them looked almost as if they had expected this. Enora, though, with her mouth hanging open, appeared as stunned as he, like a fish who had just seen the water vanish. Why? He asked gently, ignoring Faile's frustrated hiss and Elayne's exasperated grunt alike. Burn me, he thought. I'm a bloody blacksmith. Nobody swore fealty to blacksmiths. Queens did not swear fealty to anyone. I've been told I'm ta'veren. You might want to reconsider this in an hour. I hope you are ta'veren, my lord. Alliandre laughed, but not in amusement, and gripped his hands even more tightly, as though fearful he might pull away. With all my heart, I hope it. I fear nothing less will save Ghealdan. I all but reached this decision as soon as the first told me you were here, and meeting you only confirmed me in it. Ghealdan needs protection I cannot give, so duty demands I find it. You can give it, my lord, you and the Lord Dragon Reborn. Blessed be his name in the light. In truth, I would swear directly to him if he were here, but you are his man. Swearing to you, I also swear to him. Drawing a deep breath, she forced out another word. Please. She smelled desperate now, and her eyes shone with fear. Alliandre is a wise and scrappy queen, making a measured, necessary decision here. As far as queens go, Alliandre certainly doesn't appear to be particularly successful or powerful, but only from an amateur's point of view. Not unlike Morgase, now Maegden, who just continues to fall but hasn't given up yet. She willingly becomes a servant to Faile and risks being close to one of Rand's closest friends. Bear in mind that Morgase really does not know Rand or Perrin at all. Even if she believes that Rand truly does mean for Elayne to become the queen, she has no reason to believe this is out of simple love. She has to assume that it's some scheme, likely to treat Elayne as a puppet to sidestep the issue of a man ruling Andor, or perhaps to compel Elayne, subjecting Elayne to the same humiliation that Robin forced on her. With this in mind, Morgase must also assume that Rand would have her secretly killed if he could, as manipulating a teenager would surely be easier than manipulating an established queen. She's taking a terrible risk in staying near Perrin, particularly after he recognizes Gil, yet she does so without hesitation, as this puts her in a better position to aid her daughter and her kingdom. Of course, we also already knew that Faile was tough, but I was still impressed by her reaction to being taken Gaishan by the Shaido. Naked, surrounded by dead friends, and enslaved by the Shaido, Faile's first thought is, light, if only someone had managed to escape with the news of Masema. To carry word of her capture to Perrin, of course, but she could escape somehow. The other was more important. Then she goes further. Light, someone had to warn Perrin about Masema. Someone. It seemed a final blow. Here she was, shivering and gritting her teeth to keep them from chattering, trying her best to pretend that she was not stark naked and bound, on her way to an uncertain captivity. All of that, and she had to hope that slinking cat, that pouting trull, Elayne, had managed to escape so she could reach Perrin. Alongside everything else, that seemed worst of all. So Alliandre, Morgase, and Faile are all taking Gaishan by the Shaido together. A queen, a former queen, and a potential heir to a throne, all naked, shivering, and enslaved. Fallen, but likely not for long. Okay, so before we talk about Rand in particular, I'd like to dive into something I first noticed last book, when Egwene was first meeting with Brynn to discuss the war. Robert Jordan really did his research for portraying war correctly, particularly when it comes to things like logistics, which are often overlooked. I've occasionally heard friends mention that he drew his inspiration from his 2 tours in Vietnam, and I'm sure that's true, but that doesn't even come close to covering it. First off, he was a helicopter gunner, not a general. Second, the Vietnam War was very different from the sort of pre-industrial warfare we're talking about in the Wheel of Time. Forget helicopters, we don't even have trains. I find myself extremely lucky that Brett Devereaux just finished a 3-part series on logistics that I highly recommend, and I'll definitely link it below. Now, I'm certainly not an authority on military history myself, but I do find the topic fascinating, and I spent a lot of time studying it as an amateur. I am, after all, doing this entire series in the Wheel of Time for my own understanding, to help me my own creative projects, which aren't anywhere near ready to be even kind of talked about. With this in mind, I want to call out just a few of the amazing details I've seen in Jordan's writing, and a few things that we should keep in our minds when discussing Egwene's siege to Tar Valon and Rand's week-long campaign against Shan-Shan and Ebodar, and it'll likely continue to be relevant in the future. You should really just go read Devereaux's series if you have the time, as much of it is applicable here. Really, just go read all of his stuff, it's all fantastic. But for today, I'll just hit what I see as the essential points that really stick out for us here. So basically, armies need a lot of food for both the humans and the horses. Again, read Devereaux if you want all the details, but for our purposes, we can say that a soldier needs roughly 1 kilogram of food and 3 kilograms of water per day. They can eat a bit less for a while, but not indefinitely. Soldiers can usually find water, and a good general will plan to only march where water can be found, so we can mostly ignore water for this book, but we'll need to consider it if we wind up doing any fighting in a threefold land. Variety is also a concern. Soldiers can live on hardtack for a while, but they'll need meat and vegetables eventually. Note that this is actually pretty close to Perrin's estimate. Quote, he truly had been trying to avoid notice as much as possible, traveling by back roads and the smallest country paths when they could not keep to the forest. A futile effort, really. The horses could be pastured wherever there was grass, but they required at least some grain, and even a small army had to buy food, and a lot of it. Every man needed 4 pounds a day, in flour and beans and meat. Rumors must have been floating all over Geldon, though with luck no one suspected who they were. Perrin grimaced. Perhaps they had not, until he went and opened his mouth. Still, he would have done nothing differently. 4 pounds is a little higher, but maybe his men are just fed slightly better than average. Cultural expectations can shift this a fair bit, so if they feel entitled to having a little bit more meat and stuff with their rations, then it actually is kind of important to supply that, even if they technically won't starve if it's a little bit less. Now, this might not seem like a lot of food to carry, but bear in mind that the Wheel of Time takes place without industrial technology, so we can't rely on trains to move supplies over land. Of course, traveling can change this, but let's keep it simple for now. Traveling hasn't been really fully integrated into how war works yet, if it ever will be. Supplies can also be loaded onto wagons, but wagons aren't trains. Wagons only function properly on good, wide roads, and even then, they're pretty slow and take up a lot of road space. Wagons also break all the time and require maintenance. The more wagons you add, the slower the army's going to move. The slower the army moves, the more days you'll need rations for. You eventually reach a point where adding more wagons is counterproductive, the tyranny of the wagon. Also bear in mind that both war horses and draft animals need to eat. More wagons means more animals. Even without wagons, cavalry need war horses, which are bigger and require far more food than smaller horses. Draft animals may be able to get most of their food from grazing, but only if they're given time to graze and only if there's available land for grazing, which won't be the case if you stay still for too long. If you want to march quickly, you don't want to spend too much time grazing. War horses simply can't get all their nutrition from grazing, no matter how much time you give them, so you'll need to carry fodder with you as well, which will probably be too heavy to carry on hand and will take up a good chunk of your wagon space. Again, Perrin actually noted this in the quote I just provided earlier. A standard marching load is roughly 40 to 55 kilograms per person, but that includes everything that needs to be carried. Depending on the soldier's kit, they might only have space for about, say, 10 days worth of food. And after that, they're going to need to forage. Oh, and just to be sure we're on the same page, animals need rest. They actually need to rest a fair bit more than humans do. Cavalry will generally need multiple horses, both for rest and to replace injured mounts. Pack animals cannot march for as many days in a row as humans can, so you'll also need to give them some extra rest. Also bear in mind that marching is not fast. A single person could travel quite a long distance on foot in a single day, but marching isn't going to come anywhere near that. Marching when it's dark is dangerous for both people and animals, and for wagons, so you can't start too early and you can't go on too late. That might sound silly, but a broken leg on a human might take you out of the war, and a broken leg on a horse is actually usually fatal. Seriously, horses are shockingly delicate animals. As the army needs to travel on roads aren't all that wide, and camping is much safer in a circle than it is in a long column, the army can't start or stop marching all at once. In the morning, it might take hours for the last person to start marching. In the evening, the first person to stop marching might need to do so hours before it's dark. Armies also need the occasional break, and they need to move at a measured pace. The exact pace for an army, then, is a factor of the army's size and how many wagons it has, as well as the condition of the roads. A small army will move much quicker than a big army, and there are some natural caps on what's possible before adding more wagons won't help. This probably goes without saying, but cavalry makes this much worse. You can't just use the war horses to help carry supplies, and even if you did that for some reason, it would wind up being counterproductive. Rand cleverly bypasses much of this problem by keeping his campaign short, just about a week, and by using traveling to move quickly. The text specifically mentions they still have wagons, but traveling frees Rand's infantry from needing to stay on proper roads or really near the wagons at all, as they can travel away from their wagons to fight and then travel back to resupply. Robert Jordan really calls attention to this amazing development in his description of the Legion of the Dragons kit. Their only weapons are a crossbow and a short sword. Samaradrid and Waramon see this as ridiculously foolish. Infantry are useless, and doubly so if they don't have pikes. What they don't know is that Rand doesn't plan on having the Legion fight on terrain suitable for cavalry. Horses really don't do well in forests or on jagged ground. Note, by the way, that this disdain for infantry is a real thing that shows up in historical sources. The people who wrote books were generally wealthy, and wealthy people generally had horses. Therefore, infantry are pores. Of course, a good horse is really a fantastic advantage, but it makes sense for someone like Waramon to overestimate this advantage, given that he's a wealthy fool. Egwene, on the other hand, can't ignore the issue of supplying her army, and we see her continually struggle with this. The march to Tarvalon is not quick, and her army is not small. While Rand only brought around 6,000 with him to Ebodar, Bryn's army has more than 30,000 combatants in Chapter 15, and probably continues to grow over time. Also consider that soldiers aren't the only people who travel with an army. Even in an army where the intent is for everyone to be directly involved in the war effort, plenty of other people travel with the army. Again, Robert Jordan specifically mentions that even in Bryn's camp, which is separate from the Aes Sedai camp, there are plenty of people, including women, performing various tasks. Swan can't do everyone's laundry. In a particularly well-organized army, the soldiers can take over many of the non-military tasks, but maintaining this level of discipline is challenging. Depending on the culture, general, conflict, morale, etc., the number of non-combatants in an army might even match the number of combatants. In some contexts, soldiers may even want to bring their wives or even their children with them. People of means will of course want to bring their servants. Cavalry will want people to take care of their animals. Prostitution, often hidden within another profession, such as launderer, is also common, and when willing, certainly preferable to turning soldiers loose in a local population. Which brings me to the next bit of logistics I want to cover here before moving on to Rand's campaign. Foraging. Again, Davro has an entire post on foraging that I recommend, but in brief, when an army runs out of food, which recall might only take like 10 days as an absolute limit, they'll need to resupply, which requires foraging. Again, Robert Jordan explicitly calls this out in multiple places, which is just astounding detail for a fantasy author. Quote, "At one farm, Egwene saw some of Lord Bryn's foragers with a wagon. That they were his was as plain as much by the way he eyed them and nodded as by the lack of a white pennant. The band always flaunted itself. Aside from the banners, some had of late taken to wearing a red scarf tied around the arm. Half a dozen cattle and maybe 2 dozen sheep lowed and bayed under the guard of the men on the horseback, and other men toted sacks from barn to wagon past a slump-shouldered farmer and his family, a sullen lot in dark rough woolens. One of the little girls, wearing a deep bonnet like the others, had her face pressed to her mother's skirts, apparently crying. Some of the boys had their fists clenched as if they wanted to fight. The farmer would be paid, but if he could not really spare what was taken, if he had the mind to resist close on 20 men in breastplates and helmets, those burned farms would have given him pause. Quite often, Britain's soldiers found charred corpses in the ruins, men and women and children who had died trying to get out. Sometimes the doors and windows had been sealed up from the outside. Egwene wondered whether there was any way to convince the farmers and villagers that there was a difference between the brigands and the army. She wanted to, very much, but she did not see how, short of letting her own soldiers go hungry until they deserted. If the sisters could see no difference between the brigands and the band, there seemed no hope for the country folk. As the farm dwindled behind them, she resisted the urge to twist around in her saddle and look back. Looking would change nothing. Note here, in case it was unclear, that foraging is a thing done by armies against local populations. They're not out there picking berries or hunting deer. They're taking food from local farmers. Even if they do some occasional harvesting, as Roman armies sometimes did, they're still harvesting food from farmers' fields. The specifics differ from culture to culture and on whether the local people are seen as the enemy or not, but the basic fact remains. The army is stealing, even if they're technically giving some money in return, supplies from farmers. To be entirely clear, it's important to understand at least the basics of economics for pre-industrial farmers. The essential unit of production for these people is not money, it's food and clothing. Coin is useful, but only for niche needs. Metal tools, perhaps some dyes or higher quality textiles, maybe some spices, etc. In a pinch, money can be used to make up for some loss of food or clothing, but consider the market forces at play here. Who are the peasants going to buy this food from? A neighbor? Well, that only works if their neighbor has extra, which won't be the case if the whole region was foraged. A market? How far away is the nearest market, and is it safe to travel there, given that there's a war going on? Also bear in mind that coin is easily stolen, whereas grain takes a bit more effort to carry away. Having a lot of coin lying around isn't as safe as having a full stock of grain. So, how much food is there to spare? Well, they don't have electric refrigerators, so spoilage is a real concern. Food stores will be built up and depleted yearly or seasonally, depending on the region. Generally speaking, farmers aren't going to have a lot of surplus over a year, and there's no good way to replenish a depleted supply even if it happens early in that year. Losing half of your store the week after harvest is pretty much as deadly as losing all of it a couple of months before the harvest. Egwene understands all of this, and she's actually doing her best to be ethical. Granted, this is, at least in part, just a good move for the Aes Sedai, as their reputation is very important. But we can also see that Egwene cares about this on an emotional level. This is actually one of several points where Egwene and Rand are extremely similar people. When Rand first rose to power in Tyr, one of his first concerns was to feed the starving and to make the legal code more fair to peasants. Whenever possible, Rand denies the fifth to the Aiel, and even the fifth is actually pretty merciful, all considering. Likewise, Egwene fights viciously against her daughters, who would like to stop paying soldiers. Consider for a moment what that would actually mean. There are a lot of ways to pay soldiers, and it doesn't always involve money flowing from the leaders to the soldiers. Looting, which isn't fundamentally different from foraging really, is another way to pay soldiers. Simply allow the soldiers to take what they want from the local population and from anyone who's conquered. Egwene feels bad for this farm family, who we know is probably going to lose a few members to starvation because of her army, but she could have just let her soldiers steal, rape, and kill in lieu of payment. Nonetheless, it's a brutal situation to be in. That month of waiting, in winter, mind you, before the siege of Tar-Valon could also have been quite costly for the local population. Bear in mind that foraging is itself a military operation subject to the same limitations we've been talking about here. So long as an army is mobile, they can always forage new people, and if they're trying to be friendly, they can try to take only the bare minimum to keep moving. When an army needs to stand still, there's a cap on how far out they can actually ride to gather supplies. Byrne even mentions at one point that he needs to worry about things like foragers being attacked, which is a very realistic concern. In this particular case, I think we can assume that traveling opens up Egwene's options a fair bit. As a rebel army, their diplomatic options are a bit limited, but I imagine that even rebel Aes Sedai can secure more credit than most. Egwene may have also been able to lean on Andor Murundi a bit by virtue of having a large army present. There's some real historical precedent for leaders accepting supplies in exchange for staying clear of cities or leading the local population alone. The one thing I really didn't see covered by Robert Jordan was quartering. It seems that the entire army is living in a camp. Where is this camp? This region has been hit hard by recent disasters, so perhaps the local population has been severely diminished, but it still seems a bit unlikely to me that a force this large has space to just camp for an entire month. We're talking about 30,000 combatants alone. Just throwing out a number, I'd guess there's a good 50,000 or so total people in the combined Brim plus Aes Sedai camps. Bear in mind that the band is also camping fairly close by, on top of the Andorran and Mirandian armies. This is just a massive number of people, Are they quartering in farmhouses and fields, or is there just some huge uninhabited field where they can build a camp? I mean, bear in mind, quartering used to be very, very, very common. I mean, it was so prevalent that it's literally banned in the third constitutional amendment in the United States. So I'm a little surprised this isn't more explicitly addressed, or maybe I just missed it. I wouldn't necessarily call this an omission, as it's easy to come up with potential explanations. Perhaps they are quartering in farmhouses, many of which are already abandoned due to hard times in the region, and it just wasn't explicitly called out. Perhaps there actually is a very large uninhabited region along the borders of Andor and Merindy, and Bryn soldiers are sufficiently organized to construct their own winter camps. We do see some mention of Bryn organizing his men to construct at least some things, so this is actually my guess is what's happening, is there's sort of a no man's land that they're camping in. In any case, the attention to detail in Robert Jordan's writing is just absolutely stunning, and the attention to detail for logistics in particular is very impressive to me. A modern person might have some firsthand knowledge about horses, farming, or even blacksmithing, but even a vet isn't going to have firsthand experience in the logistics of a pre-industrial army. This took some real research. I'm also very glad for resources like a collection of unmitigated pedantry, which allow amateur history and literature fans like myself to actually appreciate and understand all this detail. Alright, so that was kind of a long tangent, but I really wanted to talk about it sometime, and given that The Path of Daggers is a really short Wheel of Time book, I figured that now was the best time. On the other hand, I'm up to like 14,858 words now, and I still haven't even gotten to Rand's campaign or any of the other things I want to talk about, so let's get back to the main points here. In some ways, Rand's campaign against the Shan-Shan and Ebudar was daring and clever, but he also made some real amateur mistakes. Rand's plan was actually pretty good. Using traveling to move rapidly through the mountains is just genius, and it won Rand some major battles. This isn't solely about the surprise either. This tactic will likely continue to be useful even after it becomes common knowledge, at least for a while. It takes time for new methods of war to find their place, and generals who have built their careers in a world without traveling aren't going to adjust immediately. Moreover, Rand leans into this ability hard with the Legion of the Dragon. As some of the elites point out, infantry doesn't hold up well against cavalry charge, particularly if they don't have pikes, but Rand doesn't plan on moving the Legion where cavalry can charge. Using traveling and tree cover, the Legion are able to attack from forests and rough terrain, where horses can't easily run. What's extra genius about this is that Rand also understands the problems in training people to become soldiers. Learning to wield a sword or shoot a bow in combat takes a long time. Shooting a bow on horseback is particularly challenging. Note that we've seen multiple people express awe at how proficient the Two Rivers people are at shooting on horseback, which is something they must start learning at a very young age. Shooting a crossbow on foot isn't necessarily easy, but it doesn't require nearly as much training, which allows new recruits to the Legion of the Dragon, who recall are mostly men who approach the Black Tower and were turned away for having no ability to channel and may or may not have any experience with weapons, become effective soldiers quickly, regardless of background. The first 5 days of Rand's campaign, as he harries the Shan-Shan through the mountain, go shockingly well. But Rand makes a couple of pretty huge mistakes, and they're honestly kind of obvious. First, he really just doesn't seem to understand strategy very well. As the Dragon Reborn and a powerful Taviran, Rand has grown accustomed to big, all-or-nothing moves. His focus is always on charming Gaidon, so all other concerns are trifles to be swept up in a chapter or two. With that in mind, of course his strategic goal here was to push the Shan-Shan all the way back to the sea. He wanted to wipe them off the board so he could get back to focusing on what really matters, and he was willing to use Kalimdor to force this outcome if necessary. But all he really needed here was to stop the Shan-Shan from moving on Elayne. His defeat here was actually foreshadowed pretty hard when he thinks to himself, quote, "He did not know how many had died for his mistakes, but none for his pride. He was sure of that." It's really too bad that Matt wasn't here to talk some sense into Rand. Not only would Matt's vast military experience have been a huge help, he might have also been able to get through to Rand on a personal level. Even Lews Therin tries to caution Rand, and that's before the battle at Ebudar even begins. Quote, "No plan of battle survives first contact." Rand is warned again when Dashiva warns him that Sidon is strange here. Rand's only chance at victory is in the overwhelming superiority of the Ashaman. Any disruption in their channeling could prove devastating. They're outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, and the enemy has a city to fall back to. Still, Rand goes forward with the attack. Once again, his actual plan is a pretty good one. Split up into columns to surround the enemy. Rand heeds Bashir's advice that, quote, "simple plans were best." What Rand doesn't seem to grasp is that, quote, "everything is very simple in war, but the simplest thing is difficult." That's from chapter 7 of On War. Rand underestimates the Shan-Shan and the Rakan. Rand's forces do not take the Shan-Shan by surprise, and Rand's losses are immense. We know that Bashir lost about 500, and Rand about 700. I'm not sure whether this accounts for all losses, or if it's just those from Rand and Bashir with more still to report. But even if it's just 1,200, that's really bad. Bear in mind that combat before firearms wasn't as lethal moment for moment as combat after firearms. Rand's soldiers expected to go home. They did not expect to die. Even the men in the first ranks didn't plan on just being cannon fodder. With Ashaman healers, these soldiers all expected to go home. They knew that some people wouldn't, but they expected pretty good odds. It's impossible to get a perfect number of losses before soldiers will break and flee, but Devereaux looks at some historical examples to give a very rough estimate that, quote, pre-modern armies generally seem to have fallen apart at or before 10% losses. Well, 1,200 out of 6,000 is already 20%. Side note, the actual fatalities at the end of a battle could actually be much, much higher than 10%, but much of that killing would take place after one side breaks as the victors run them down. Rand probably doesn't need to worry so much about this, as the Ashaman can probably cover retreat or just travel everyone to safety. Also note the overall mood of Rand's armies. They've been fighting frequently for several days now, and they must be exhausted. Despite its size, this army is comprised of multiple cultures that hate each other. They're not only fighting against the Shan-Shan, but also quickly conquered Terabonners, and also actual fucking monsters. They're fighting enslaved women who can channel. Their only real hope is men who can channel, assuming that they don't go mad and kill their own side. Morale is probably actually pretty high. They're fighting under the Dragon Reborn, and they're fighting against foreign invaders from another continent bent on dominating the world. That's a pretty inspiring cause. The problem is cohesion. They're fighting with hated foes on their sides, and also men who can channel. Even the Ashaman have their faith in Rand shaken by his perceived weakness, that he doesn't even notice that Saidin is acting strangely here. So let me be clear here. Even before Rand called down a cataclysmic lightning storm on his own soldiers, he really wasn't going to be able to hold the ranks together much longer. Everyone knew this but him. Kalendor may have magnified the taint, but Rand was committed to getting his men killed by his pride before he even reached for it. Bashir does his best to explain this to Rand. Quote, part of fighting is knowing when to go, and it's time. You aren't thinking straight. That was a good plan in the beginning, but their general thinks fast. He spread out to blunt our attacks before we could fall on him and spread out our marching. We've cost him even so, it seems, and now he's pulling everything together. You won't catch him by surprise. He wants us to come at him. He's out there waiting for it. Ashaman or no Ashaman, if we stand nose to nose with this fellow, I think maybe the vultures grow fat and nobody rides away. But Rand doesn't listen. Quote, nobody stands nose to nose with the Dragon Reborn, Rand growled. The Forsaken could tell him that, whoever he is. Right, Flynn? Dashiva? Flynn nodded uncertainly. Dashiva flinched. You think I can't surprise him, Bashir? Watch. Pulling the long bundle loose, he stripped away the cloth covering, and Rand heard gasps as raindrops glistened on a sword seemingly made of crystal, the sword that is not a sword. Let's see if he's surprised by Kalendor in the hands of the Dragon Reborn, Bashir. Cradling the translucent blade in the crook of his elbow, Rand rode Tidashar forward a few steps. There was no reason to. He had no clearer view from there, except something spidered across the outer surface of the void, a wriggling black web. He was afraid. The last time he had used Kalendor, really used it, he had tried to bring the dead back to life. He had been sure he could do anything then, anything at all, like a madman thinking he could fly. But he was the Dragon Reborn. He could do anything. Had he not proved it time and again? He reached for the source through the sword that is not a sword. Saidin seemed to leap into Kalendor before he touched the source through it. From pommel to point, the crystal sword shone with a white light. He had only thought the power filled him before. Now he held more than 10 men could have unaided. 100. He did not know how many. The fires of the sun searing through his head. The cold of all the winters of the ages, eating into his heart. In that torrent, the taint was all the midden heaps in the world, emptying into his soul. Saidin still tried to kill him, tried to scour away, burn away, freeze away every scrap of him. But he fought, and he lived for a moment more, and another moment, another. He wanted to laugh. He could do anything. Once, while holding Kalendor, he had made a weapon that searched out Shadowspawn through the Stone of Tyr, struck them dead with hunting lightning wherever they stood or ran or hid. Surely there must be something like that to use against his enemies here. But when he called to Lews Therin, only anguished whimpers answered, as if that disembodied voice feared the pain of Saidin. With Kalendor blazing in his hand, he did not remember raising the blade overhead. He stared at the hills where his enemies hid. They were gray now, with thickening rain and dense black clouds blocking the sun. What was it he had told Egamperos? I am the storm, he whispered, a shout in his ears, a roar, and he channeled. Overhead, the clouds boiled. Where they had been the black of soot, they became midnight, the heart of midnight. He did not know what he was channeling. So often he did not, in spite of Asmodean's teaching. Maybe Lews Therin was guiding him, in spite of the man's weeping. Flows of Saidin spun across the sky, wind and water and fire. Fire. The sky truly did rain lightning, 100 bolts at once, hundreds, forked blue-white shafts stabbing down as far as he could see. The hills before him erupted. Some flew apart under the torrent of lightning like kicked anthills. Flames sprang up in thickets, trees turning to torches in the rain, flames racing through olive orchards. Something struck him hard, and he realized he was picking himself up from the ground. The crown had fallen from his head. Kalandor still blazed in his hand, though. Vaguely, he was aware of Tidashar scrambling to his feet, trembling. So they thought to strike back at him, did they? Shoving Kalandor high, he screamed at them. "Come against me if you dare. I am the storm. Come if you dare, Shaitan. I am the dragon reborn." 1,000 signaling lightning bolts hailed from the clouds. Again, something struck him down. He tried to fight up again. Kalandor, still shining, lay a pace from his outstretched hand. The sky shattered with lightnings. Suddenly, he realized that the weight atop him was Bashir, that the man was shaking him. It must have been Bashir who had flung him down. "Stop it!" the Seldian shouted. Blood fanned down his face from a split across his scalp. "You're killing us, man! Stop!" Rand turned his head, and one stunned look was enough. Lightnings flashed all around him in every direction. A bolt stabbed down into the reverse slope, where Denharad and the armsmen were. The screams of men and horses rose. Aniela and Ailil were both afoot, trying vainly to quiet mounts that reared, eyes rolling, trying to rip reins free. Flynn was bending over someone, not far from a dead horse with legs already stiff. Rand let Sidon go. He let it go, but for moments it still flowed into him. The lightning raged. The flow into him dwindled, tailed off and vanished. Dizziness swept through him in its place. For 3 more heartbeats, 2 of Kalandor shone where they lay on the ground, and lightning fell. Then silence except for the rising drum of the rain, and the screams from behind the hill. Slowly, Bashir climbed off of him, and Rand rose unaided on tottering legs, blinking as his sight returned to normal. The Seldian watched him as he might have a rabid lion, fingering his sword hilt. Aniela took one look at Rand on his feet and collapsed in a faint. Her horse dashed away, reins dangling. Ailil, still fighting her rearing animal, spared few glances for Rand. Rand let Kalandor lie where it was for a moment. He was not sure he dared pick it up. Not yet. Flynn straightened, shaking his head, and then stood silently as Rand went unsteadily to stand beside him. The rain fell on Jonan and Adley's sightless eyes, bulging as if in horror. Jonan had been one of the first. Those screams from behind the hill seemed to slice through the rain. How many more, Rand wondered. Among the defenders? The companions? Among... Rain, thick as a blanket, hid the hills where the Shanshan army lay. Had he hurt them at all, striking out blindly? Or were they still waiting out there with all their damane, waiting to see how many more of his own he could kill for them? "Set whatever guard you need," Rand told Bashir. His voice was iron, one of the first. His heart was iron. "When Gregorin and the others reach us, we'll travel to where the carts are waiting as fast as we can." Bashir nodded without speaking and turned away in the rain. "I've lost," Rand thought dully. "I'm the Dragon Reborn, but for the first time, I've lost." Suddenly, Lews Therin raged up inside him. Sly Diggs forgotten. "I have never been defeated," he snarled. "I am the Lord of the Morning. No one can defeat me." Rand sat in the rain, turning the crown of swords in his hands, looking at Kalandor lying in the mud. He let Lews Therin rage. So that's actually a pretty good segue into talking about madness, but I still have one point to cover here. Was this a defeat for Rand? For the Shanshan? At the very end of the chapter, we learn that Mirage, the Captain General of the Shanshan forces, dies in the battle. Now, I don't know what the Shanshan's military titles are, but this probably makes him the army leader of all Shanshan in this continent, perhaps even all Shanshan armies. This is also the second defeat the Shanshan suffered on these shores. The ever-victorious army kind of needs a new name now. But what does this actually mean for Shanshan's big-picture strategic goals? They lost a lot of soldiers, but many of those were from Terabon anyways, and there's presumably a whole empire's worth of soldiers back home. Bear in mind that these forces are just the Forerunners, defeated by the Horn of Valir and regrouped by Surath. Their primary mission seems to be scouting and preparing a landing for future waves. Rand pushed them out of the mountains, but they were only really there in preparation to attack Ilium, which they don't even really need, necessarily. The loss of some damane is a bit of a concern, but there are plenty of Marath damane to capture here, and Soldam generally outnumber damane anyways, so losing the Soldam doesn't even really make that big of a difference. The Shanshan still hold multiple ports that they can use to land future armies. They still hold significant land, from Tanchico to Ebodar. This is still an impressive victory for Surath, personally, and it sets the Shanshan up quite well for future invasions. Well, what about the impact on their morale? So on the one hand, this was a heavy blow, as the catastrophic loss of troops hinders the Shanshan's image of perfection. But they already kind of lost that in the Great Hunt. We don't know much about how the Shanshan work at home, but it sure seems like the Empress has near absolute control over her country. I actually have a sneaking suspicion that the Crystal Throne might actually be a ter'angreal capable of compulsion, but that's just wild, wild speculation at this point. But honestly, I don't think that even matters here. The Shan-Shan's defeat by men who can channel is actually fantastic propaganda for them. I mean, think about it. They're not going to report back that they were defeated by a ragtag coalition led by an arrogant young man. They're going to report that the savages across the sea, who are already known to revere Marath Damane, also integrate men who can channel into their armies, even if that occasionally means calling down a storm on themselves. These savages don't even value their own lives. We must free their people and organize them before the corrupt rulers hand the world to the Dark One. People are willing to tolerate tremendous losses when the cause is just, and Rand's lightning storm just gave them some killer motivation. So really, this wasn't that big of a defeat for the Shan-Shan. It's possible that Suroth will be punished, or maybe some other, mid-level leaders, but the Empire probably isn't going to feel much pain. Rand, on the other hand, suffered a major setback. Everyone who witnessed his storm is going to remember the Dragon Reborn going mad and starting to break the world. He already lost a handful of Asha'man by the end of the book. Rand's legitimacy derives from his perceived greatness as the Dragon Reborn. Losing even one battle, particularly in such a spectacular way, hurts him. It gives his enemies propaganda to turn against him, and it will give his allies pause in riding with him in the future. Bashir had to physically stop Rand from killing them all. Bashir, one of the only people who Rand trusted, might look at him a little bit differently now. Trying to explain this away as Kalendor being weird isn't going to really fly with most people. And again, it's really not even the point. This isn't the first time Rand has gone a bit crazy during a battle either. Remember when he wandered around long after the battle was over at Kiriam? Rand also has a tendency to form secret plans that nobody else knows about and conduct them without explaining himself. Until now, it's generally worked. I mean, except for the time he was captured and nobody knew about it for days because they just assumed he was traveling someplace. But, I mean, this time it really didn't work. You can get away with quite a bit if it works, but not if it doesn't. What will people think the next time Rand goes sneaking around, making plans he refuses to tell anyone? Now, bear in mind that none of these mistakes are really surprising for Rand personally, but they're shocking for someone in his position. In this setting, kings and generals are trained for these jobs since birth. They have Aes Sedai advisors. Chaldeans generally bring their wives with them, and almost any person in a position of so much power would have at least a handful of friends and trusted allies. Rand doesn't really have any of these things. He was forced into this position with little warning, he really can't trust many people, and Kedsuan probably sees this defeat as a necessary step in Rand's development, even if she had been actively advising him. The only really stupid thing here is that Rand didn't just accept that he doesn't know how to be a general and lean harder on Bashir. Again, we see that Egwene is doing this. Egwene is pretty full of herself sometimes, but she has no problem being like, all right, Bryn, you take care of the military stuff. That's not my thing. So what works for Rand when he's acting alone doesn't work nearly so well when he's acting as a leader. His various duels with the Forsaken have all gone pretty well, but a one-on-one duel isn't the same as a battle. It's much easier to lose your footing on a path paved with daggers. Okay, yeah, so this post is getting really long. Let's move on to the next topic, which is madness. So we're really starting to see some more very overt signs of poor mental health in Rand. We've reached a point where I think we can say that he still isn't going magically mad, but he is definitely suffering some major personality ailments. This time around, we don't really need to speculate as much on this, as Rand's decline is actually spelled out pretty clearly with very deliberate choice of words. Quote, Kedsuan felt a rising thrill of possibility. If she had had any doubts that Soraleda wanted to feel her out, they were gone. And you do not feel out someone in this manner unless you hope for some agreement. Do you believe a man must be hard? She asked. She was taking a chance. Or strong. By her tone, she left no doubt she saw a difference. Again, Soralea touched the tray. The smallest of smiles might have quirked her lips for an instant. Or not. Most men see the two as one and the same, Kedsuan Meledrin. Strong endures. Hard shatters. Kedsuan drew a breath. A chance she would have scoured anyone else for taking, but she was not anyone else, and sometimes chances had to be taken. The boy confuses them, she said. He needs to be strong and makes himself harder. Too hard already, and he will not stop until he is stopped. He has forgotten how to laugh except in bitterness. There are no tears left in him. Unless he finds laughter and tears again, the world faces disaster. He must learn that even the Dragon Reborn is flesh. If he goes to Tarmangaidan as he is, even his victory may be as dark as his defeat. Soralea listened intently, and kept silent even after Kedsuan finished. Those green eyes studied her. Your Dragon Reborn and your last battle are not in our prophecies, Soralea said at last. We have tried to make Randall Thor know his blood, but I fear he sees us as only another spear. If one spear breaks in your hand, you do not pause to mourn before taking up another. Perhaps you and I aim at targets not too far apart. Strong endures, hard shatters. An old proverb even in our age. But what does Rand think about strength? Well, we see his thoughts in the very next chapter. Quote, "Did I ask for your opinions?" Rand snapped harshly. Babel became silence, except for the crack of cloaks and banners flapping in the wind. Suddenly, expressionless faces regarded him, more than one going gray. They did not know he held the power, but they knew him. Not all of what they knew was truth, but it was just as well they believed. "You will come with me, Gregorin," he said in a more normal voice. Still hard, though. Steel was all they understood. Go soft and they would turn on him. The chapter even ends with the words, quote, "Fire and ice, and death was coming, but he was steel. He was steel." So, yeah, Sorlea and Ketsuan have it exactly right. As Ketsuan notes, the Aiel perspective on this is slightly different from her own. The Aiel noted a long way back, when they first made Aviendha stay by him, that Rand kind of needs something to tie him to the Aiel, to see them as kin and not just as a tool. Sorlea's goal is to make that remnant of a remnant as large as possible. Ketsuan's goal is actually pretty similar, but it is far more general. She needs to keep Rand from going mundanely mad from the burden of his duty. Death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. Sounds great, but I mean, even Lan got married. Let's look at another quote from the chapter after that. Quote, Rand cut in. "What do you mean Sidon was worse there?" Dashiva moved, eyeing Moore oddly, reaching as though to seize the young man. Rand fended him off roughly. "What do you mean, Moore?" Moore stared, mouth shut tight, running his thumb up and down the length of his sword hilt. The heat inside of him seemed ready to burst out. There really was sweat beading on his face now. "Sidon was strange," he said hoarsely, his words come in rapid bursts. "Worse there, I could feel it, in the air all around me, but strange everywhere around Evodar, and even 100 miles away. I had to fight it. Not like always, different, like it was alive. Sometimes it didn't do what I wanted. Sometimes it did something else. It did. I'm not mad. It did." The wind gusted, howling for a moment, shivering and snapping the tent walls, and Moore felt silent. Narishma's bells chimed at a jerk of his head, then were still. "That isn't possible," Dashiva muttered under the silence, but nearly under his breath. "It is not possible." "Who knows what's possible?" Rand said. "I don't. Do you?" Dashiva's head came up in surprise, but Rand turned to Moore, moderating his tone. "Don't worry, man." Not a mild tone. He could not manage that. Yet heartening, he hoped. His making, his responsibility. "You'll be with me to the last battle. I promise it." The young man nodded and scrubbed at his face with his hand as though surprised to find it damp, but he glanced at Torval, who had gone as still as stone. Did Moore know about the wine? It was a mercy, given the alternatives. A small and bitter mercy. Rand picked up Time's missive, folded the page, and thrust it into his coat pocket. 1 in 50 mad already, and more to come. Was more next? Dashiva was surely close. Hopwill's stares took on a new meaning, and even Narishma's habitual quiet. Madness did not always mean screaming about spiders. He had asked once, warily, where he knew the answers would be true, how to cleanse the taint from Sidon, and got a riddle for answer. Herod Fell had claimed the riddle stated, sound principles in both high philosophy and natural philosophy, but he had not seen any way to apply it to the problem at hand. Had Fell been killed because he might have puzzled out the riddle? Rand had a hint at the answer, or thought he might, a guess that could be disastrously wrong. Hints and riddles were not answers, yet he had to do something. If the taint was not cleansed somehow, Time and Gaiden might find a world already ruined by madmen. What had to be done had to be done. "That would be wondrous," Torval said in near whisper. "But how could anyone short of the Creator, or—" He trailed off uneasily. Rand did not realize he had spoken any of his thoughts aloud. Narishma's eyes and Moore's and Hopwill's belonged in one face, shining with sudden hope. Dashiva looked poleaxed. Rand hoped he had not said too much. Some secrets had to be kept, including what he would do next. In short order, Hopwill was running for his horse to ride to the ridge with orders for the nobles, Moore and Dashiva to find Flynn and the other Ashaman, and Torval was striding off to travel back to the Black Tower with commands for Time. Narishma was last, and thinking of Aes Sedai and Shan-Chan and weapons, Rand sent him away as well, with careful instructions that made the young man's mouth tighten. "Speak to no one," Rand finished softly, gripping Narishma's arm hard, "and don't fail me, not by a hair." "I won't fail," Narishma said, unblinking. With a quick salute, he was gone too. "Dangerous," a voice whispered in Rand's head. "Oh yes, very dangerous. Maybe too dangerous, but it might work, it might. In any event, you must kill Torval now. You must." Wereman entered the council tent, shouldering aside Gregorin and Tolmarin, trying to shoulder aside Rosanna and Samaradred, the lot of them eager to tell Rand that the men in the trees had decided wisely after all. They found him laughing till tears rolled down his face. Lews Therin had come back, or else he really was mad already. Either way, it was reason to laugh. So, there are a couple of things to note here. First off, Rand literally ends the chapter laughing till tears roll down his face. So, laughter and tears. Likely not the sort of laughter and tears that Quetzalcoatl intended, but beneath the desperate, sardonic laughter here, Rand actually does accidentally reveal a sliver of hope. He intends to cleanse Saidin, and he clearly hopes that Kalimdor might be the key. Torval's wording here is dead on. How could anyone short of the Creator? When Quetzalcoatl tells Rand that Kalimdor is flawed, he's devastated. Quote, Rand barely heard her. He had hoped to use Kalimdor again, hoped it would be strong enough. Now only one chance remained, and it terrified him. He seemed to hear another woman's voice, a dead woman's voice. You could challenge the Creator. I mean, he just needs 2 women to channel with him, so he doesn't really need to be this despondent. I mean, 2/3 of the women who intend to marry him can channel, though he does have to be wondering whether a woman can actually touch Saidin to repair it. The other bit of hope here is thoroughly snuffed out in Mor. Note how Rand instantly moves to comfort Mor. Rand may come off as very hard and cold-hearted, but I mean, his immediate emotional reaction to seeing Mor, fearful of going mad, is to want to do anything he can to comfort the man. Which is part of what makes chapter 29 so absolutely devastating. I mean, you knew this was coming. Here's the quote. A glimpse of a black coat ahead, and his hand shot up, fire streaking, exploding, tearing away the corner where the 2 hallways met. Rand let the weave subside, but did not let it go. Had he killed him? My Lord Dragon! A voice shouted from behind the torn stonework. It's me, Narishma, and Flim. I didn't recognize you, Rand lied. Come here. I think maybe your blood's hot, Flynn's voice called. I think maybe we should wait for everybody to cool down. Yes, Rand said slowly. Had he really tried to kill Narishma? He did not think he could claim the excuse of Lews Therin. Yes, that might be best, for a little while longer. There was no answer. Did he hear boots retreating? He forced his hands down and turned another way. He searched through the palace for hours without finding a sign of Dashiva or the others. The corridors and great halls, even the kitchens, were empty of people. He found nothing and learned nothing. No, he realized that he had learned one thing. Trust was a knife, and the hilt was as sharp as the blade. Then he found pain. The small, stone-walled room was deep below the Sun Palace and warm despite the lack of a fireplace, but Min felt cold. 3 gilded lamps on the tiny wooden table gave more than enough light. Rand had said that from there, he could get her away even if someone tried to root the palace out of the ground. He had not sounded as if he was joking. Holding the crown of Elayne on her lap, she watched Rand watching Fedwin. Her hands tightened on the crown and loosened immediately at the stabs of those small swords hidden among the laurel leaves. Strange, the crown and scepter should have survived when the dragon throne itself was a pile of gilded splinters buried in rubble. A large leather script beside her chair, with Rand's sword belt and scabbard sword rested against it, held what else had he been able to salvage. Strange choices for the most part, in her estimation. You brainless looby, she thought. Not thinking about what's right in front of you won't make it go away. Rand sat cross-legged on the bare stone floor, still covered in dust and scratches, his coat torn. His face might have been carved. He seemed to watch Fedwin without blinking. The boy was sitting on the floor too, his legs sprawled out. Tongue caught between his teeth, Fedwin was concentrating on making a tower of blocks of wood. Min swallowed hard. She could still remember the horror when she realized the boy, guarding her, now had the mind of a small child. The sadness remained too. Light, he was only a boy. It was not right. But she hoped Rand still had him shielded. It had not been easy, talking Fedwin into playing with those wooden blocks instead of pulling stones out of the walls of the power to make a big tower to keep you safe in. And then she had sat guarding him until Rand came. Oh, Light, she wanted to cry, for Rand even more than Fedwin. You hide yourself in the depths, it appears. The deep voice was not finished speaking from the doorway before Rand was on his feet, facing Mazrim Time. As usual, the hook-nosed man wore a black coat with blue and gold dragons spiraling up the arms. Unlike the other Ashaman, he had neither sword nor dragon on his high collar. His dark face wore nearly as little expression as Rand's. Now, staring at Time, Rand seemed to be gritting his teeth. Min surreptitiously eased a knife in her coat sleeve. As many images and auras danced around one as the other, but it was not a viewing that made her suddenly wary. She had seen a man trying to decide whether to kill another before, and she was seeing it again. You come here holding Saidin, Time? Rand said, much too softly. Time spread his hands, and Rand said, That's better. But he did not relax. It was just that I thought I might be stabbed by accident, Time said, making my way here through corridors packed with those Aiel women. They seem agitated. His eyes never left Rand, but Min was sure he had noticed her touching her knife. Understandably, of course, he went on smoothly. I cannot express my joy at finding you alive after seeing what I did above. I came to report deserters. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered, but these are Egwene, Rochad, Torval, and Kismet. It seems they were malcontented over events in Altera, but I never thought they would go this far. I haven't seen any of the men I left with you. For an instant, his gaze flickered to Fedwin. For no more than an instant. There were other casualties? I will take this one with me if you wish. I told him to stay out of sight, Rand said in a harsh voice. And I'll take care of Fedwin. Fedwin more time, not this one. He actually backed to the small table to pick the silver cup sitting among the lamps. Min's breath caught. The wisdom of my village could cure anything, Rand said as he knelt beside Fedwin. Somehow, he managed to smile at the boy without taking his eyes from time. Fedwin smiled back happily and tried to take the cup, but Rand held it for him to drink. She knows more about herbs than anyone I've ever met. I learned a little from her, which are safe, which not. Fedwin sighed as Rand took the cup away and held the boy to his chest. Sleep, Fedwin, Rand murmured. It did seem that the boy was going to sleep. His eyes closed, his chest rose and fell more slowly, slower, until it stopped. The smile never left his lips. A little something in the wine, Rand said softly as he laid Fedwin down. Min's eyes burned, but she would not cry. She would not. You are harder than I thought, Time muttered. Rand smiled at him. A hard, feral smile. Add Corlin Dashiva to your list of deserters, Time. Next time I visit the Black Tower, I expect to see his head on your traitor's tree. Dashiva! Time snarled, his eyes widening in surprise. It will be as you say, when next you visit the Black Tower. That quickly, he recovered himself, all polished stone and poised once more. How she wished she could read her viewings of him. Return to the Black Tower and don't come here again. Standing, Rand faced the other man over Fedwin's body. I may be moving about for a while. Time's bow was minuscule, as you command. As the door closed behind him, Min let out a long breath. No point wasting time, and no time to waste, Rand muttered. Kneeling in front of her, he took the crown and slipped it into the script with the other things. Min, I thought I was the whole pack of hounds, chasing down one wolf after another, but it seems I'm the wolf. Burn you, she breathed. Tangling both hands in his hair, she stared in his eyes. Now blue, now gray, a morning sky just at sunrise. And dry. You can cry, Rand al'Thor. You won't melt if you cry. I don't have time for tears either, Min, he said gently. Sometimes the hounds catch the wolf and wish they hadn't. Sometimes he turns on them or waits in ambush. But first, the wolf has to run. When do we go? She asked. She did not let go of his hair. She was never going to let go of him. Never. Yeah, that was rough. But there's a few points we need to pick apart here. First, we finally have a close-up example of someone going mad from the taint, and it does not look anything like what Rand's going through. Mor didn't slowly decline into paranoia, arrogance, and anger. His mind seems to have just detached from reality. He still even obeyed Rand and wanted to protect Min in his own way. Even his basic personality and loyalties seem to be more or less intact. He's just mad. We can't even say that there was a clue in his admission that Sidon felt odd to control, as we discovered that all Ashaman sensed this near Ebodar. As far as we can tell, it really just came on without warning, suddenly, without any early symptoms. Maybe it doesn't always work this way, but this is the only really good example we have. Second, Rand might not be going mad from the taint, but he is definitely in a dark, bad place. I mean, anyone would be. This book was rough for Rand, and he was already under an insane amount of pressure. If Ketswan has a plan to soften Rand, I hope it starts working quickly, because I don't know how much longer you can take this. Don't let Mor completely dominate that scene either. Note the simple line, I didn't recognize you, Rand lied. A few of the Ashaman seized the opportunity to flee in the chaos Mor caused, and Rand was ready to start burning anyone in a black coat. Oh, there's just one more thing too. Why was Time affected so much more by Dashiva's desertion? Is it just because Rand knew before he did? I mean, we still don't have any real evidence that Time is Demandred, but if he is, then maybe there's a bit more to Dashiva than we've seen so far. I mean, we haven't heard one damn thing from Osangar in a long time now, not since he first showed up. But we know that Arengar is specifically hiding amongst the Aes Sedai. Wouldn't Shaitan want to have an agent close to Rand as well? Maybe an agent who finally got cold feet after he was almost killed by a lightning storm? Now, this is just wild speculation, but I don't know. Dashiva was acting a little strange this book. I mean, he's always kind of distracted, but why was he so sure that it was impossible for Sidon to be weird around Ebodar when Mor first reported it? And why was he so certain that Rand was wrong and asserting that the strangeness around Ebodar was just him feeling the taint a bit more? Dashva was taught at the Black Tower. He isn't as experienced as Rand is. Why is he so confident in his understanding of Side-In? Wow, okay. I honestly expected this one to be a little bit shorter than the rest, given how short this book was. I was hoping to fill in the gaps a bit by covering the logistic stuff, but I didn't expect this post to be like double the length of all the other ones. I think I used more quotes this time around. Let me know if that was good and you enjoyed seeing the longer quotes, or if it was just obnoxious and I should try to trim it down a little bit more and just keep this content to my own observations and leave reading the book to reading the book. I actually did have a couple of other topics I really wanted to dig into, but at this point it's, I don't know. Let me know in the comments if this isn't too long, but I know it's long enough that the editor I use, I actually typed this up in WordPress, which I'm still putting this up in a written form before actually, recording it and editing the video version of it. The WordPress editor can't handle this. Once I got up to around 20,000 words, it just totally crapped out. The spell checker broke. At one point it crashed and lost a few paragraphs. So, I mean, I can write it in a different program and then move it over, or just give up on WordPress altogether, since I think most of the people consuming this content are seeing it on YouTube, not on WordPress. But in any case, I'm wrapping it up now. Still, I do want to just very, very briefly just mention a couple of things that I don't have time to go into in greater depth. And first off, we have the game of Shara from Mordin's section at the very beginning. I originally intended to just quote the entire section, but you can just go look it up if you want. The game itself is really neat, but what's really cool is Mordin's comment that, quote, perhaps the fissure did come from some dim remnant of a memory of Rand al'Thor, the shadow of a shadow. The notion that even superficial features like the wound in Rand's side may be repeated in the pattern is just fascinating. I also just really wanted to mention that we got several Elayne perspective chapters this book, and I found her unique voice to be just absolutely adorable. Quote, snatching the flecks of jealousy that suddenly were floating through her, she pushed them into a sack and stuffed it into the back of her head. Then she jumped up and down on it for good measure. That's just cute. She also takes the time to note pretty things in her surroundings whenever she's not too busy. I mean, she named her horse Lioness, and then when Lioness died, she had the very determined thought she would weep for Lioness later. I mean, Robert Jordan is just amazing at writing each character's perspective to suit their actual character and their voice, but I think Elayne's might be the most just immediately charming. I liked it a lot. Oh, and before we get going, I also just realized now that I didn't actually have time to go into the amazing scene of the description of circles and the usage of the Bowl of the Winds. I mean, the only really critical part for us really is the whole bit that entering a circle or passing control of it requires a voluntary surrender, which doesn't really mesh with the idea that the water bond is sort of a type of circle, as that one, as we've seen, does not require a voluntary surrender. So there's something going on there. The actual usage of the bowl is really, really cool. The description is amazing, but just reread chapter 5, The Breaking Storm, if you want to relive that. I also wanted to touch on Alliandre and Elayne unraveling weaves. That Mordin is shocked at it is really interesting, as this may be yet another new ability of this age, and that could have some major consequences. I wonder if an Angreal makes unraveling easier. What sorts of things could Alliandre unravel while directing Kalandor with Rand and Elayne? Maybe even something made by the creator? For that matter, what ills could Nynaeve heal while directing Kalandor? This unweaving and Kalandor, it feels like we're starting to get some little pictures like that, and then Nynaeve curing Severing. It feels like we're starting to get a bunch of little things that might come together in a big way later in the series when we're trying to, for example, cleanse Side-In, or, shove Shaitan back in his prison, or maybe even seal him away in a more permanent fashion. But in any case, that's it for me today. I really hope you like this. As always, please leave a comment with any thoughts. I've been really, really loving all the comments I get that are kind of digging into things, having alternate perspectives, sometimes even corrections, which I really, really value. I don't want to be wrong. Even just like a like or a subscription, I really appreciate the kind of engagement and the support I've been getting so far. Continue to not put spoilers in the comments. I really, really appreciate that everyone's been really careful about not spoiling anything so far. That really means a lot to me. Please keep it going. I really don't want to ruin the book, either for myself or for anyone else that might be watching these videos along with me, rather than going back on it afterwards. And I'm really looking forward to starting the next book. Should be, probably another 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how things go. And we'll have the next video out. So until then.